In the grand halls of history, crowns glitter, but shadows always lurk. Behind every royal portrait lies a tangle of secret affairs, betrayals, murders, and indulgences so wild they make modern scandals look tame. Tonight, we pull back the velvet curtain on 101 of the most scandalous facts about kings and queens. No fairy tales here, only raw power, whispered rumors, and the sins they tried to bury. From palace bedrooms to blood-soaked thrones, welcome to the side of royalty you were never meant to see. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another journey into history's darkest corners. And hey, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Are you catching this in the middle of the night? Or sneaking it in at work? King Edward VIII of the United Kingdom abdicated the throne in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, and was later revealed to have expressed sympathy toward Nazi Germany. It was the romance that shook an empire, then cast a shadow over it for decades. In 1936, Edward VIII was at the top of the world, young, handsome, the King of the United Kingdom and the British Dominions, Emperor of India, ruler over nearly a quarter of the planet's population, and he gave it all up for love. At least, that's how the official story goes. Wallis Simpson was an American socialite, twice divorced, polished like a diamond, sharp as a blade. She was the kind of woman the British establishment hated and feared: a foreigner, a divorcee, and someone who didn't seem remotely interested in playing the demure royal wife. Edward, however, was obsessed. His ministers begged him to give her up. The Archbishop of Canterbury warned him of spiritual ruin. The press, muzzled in Britain but roaring abroad, hinted at scandal. Edward refused. "I have found it impossible," he told the nation in his famous abdication speech, "to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love." Cue the collective swoon. But history's second act for this royal couple was less of a fairy tale and more of a noir film. By the late 1932, evidence began to surface that Edward and Wallis had more than just an awkward sympathy for Nazi Germany. They'd actually met with Hitler. Letters suggested admiration for the regime. The whispers grew into accusations that the former king might have been used by Germany as a potential puppet monarch if Britain fell. Winston Churchill quietly arranged for the Duke and Duchess of Windsor to be sent far away to the Bahamas, conveniently governor and governess of a sleepy colony. The man who once wore the crown ended up in gilded exile, hosting dinner parties and nursing what-ifs. And while Britain fought for its survival, its almost king lived out a strange, scandal-soaked retirement. But Edward VIII wasn't the first royal to keep dangerous secrets from the public. One French king went further, turning a hidden residence into something much darker than a love nest. French King Louis XV kept a secret brothel-like residence, the Parc aux Cerfs, filled with young mistresses hidden from public view. On the polished surface of Versailles, Louis XV projected an image of refined elegance. He was Louis the Beloved in his early years, a golden monarch in the glittering heart of 18th century France. But somewhere along the way, the shine dulled. Whispers became rumors. Rumors became something worse. Tucked away in a quiet corner of Versailles, in a modest building far from the Grand Hall of Mirrors, there existed a place known only to a select few. The Parc aux Cerfs. The name sounds idyllic, Deer Park, but its purpose was far less innocent. It was essentially a private harem, stocked with young women, procured to please the king. Girls as young as 14 were recruited by intermediaries, kept in discreet comfort, and rotated in and out according to the king's changing appetites. They were told they would be companions to His Majesty, but the arrangement was no innocent companionship. The operation was run like a shadow institution of Versailles, with strict secrecy and careful selection to avoid political blowback. Some historians have argued that Louis retreated to the Parcox serfs out of boredom with court life, while others suggest it was his way of keeping affairs away from powerful mistresses who might manipulate politics. Whatever the motive, the reality was scandalous, hidden in plain sight, funded by the royal purse, and a stark contrast to the grinding poverty beyond Versailles' gilded gates. When word finally leaked, it became another blow to the monarchy's moral authority. Satirical pamphlets depicted the king as a jaded libertine drowning in decadence. Louis's once beloved title soured. He died widely hated, leaving behind a court that had perfected the art of smiling while rotting from within. And if Louis XV's secret house was a slow-burning scandal, the next emperor's behavior was an explosion, violent, bizarre, and unforgettable. Emperor Nero allegedly kicked his pregnant wife to death, then married a boy named Sporus, having him castrated to resemble her. Rome had seen cruel emperors before, but Nero seemed determined to be remembered as something else, entirely equal parts tyrant, actor, and unhinged romantic. In 65 AD, his marriage to Poppaea Sabina reached its breaking point. Accounts differ, but one version recorded by Roman historians, with the kind of horrified relish that sticks, claims Nero, in a fit of rage, kicked his pregnant wife so violently that both she and the unborn child died. It would have been shocking enough if the story ended there. But Nero didn't just grieve in twisted ways, he remade his grief into a macabre performance. Not long after Poppaea's death, Nero found a young boy named Sporus, castrated him, and dressed him to look like the dead empress. Same hairstyle, same clothing, same jewelry. Nero married him in a public ceremony, complete with bridal veil, and paraded him through the streets as if nothing was unusual. To the Roman elite, it was scandal stacked on scandal. They had already endured Nero's theatrics, his obsession with performing on stage, his costly building projects, and his rumoured role in the Great Fire of Rome. But this was the emperor tearing down the line between imperial dignity and grotesque self-indulgence. Some historians have speculated that Nero saw Sporus as a living memorial, a way to keep his wife with him. Others see it as pure domination, bending a human being entirely to his will. Either way, the image of the emperor walking hand in hand with his emasculated bridegroom became a symbol of Rome's decay. And yet, in the grand pageant of royal scandals, Nero's macabre wedding wasn't even the most politically dangerous marriage in history. For that, we look to a king whose matrimonial habits would leave not just his wives, but the entire English monarchy shaking. King Henry VIII of England had two of his wives executed on charges of adultery and treason, often believed to be politically motivated lies. If marriage is a gamble, Henry VIII treated it like high-stakes poker with live ammunition. Over his 38-year reign, the English king married 6 times, but it's the fates of 2 wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, that have burned themselves into the collective memory like a bloody crest. Anne was wife number 2, the woman for whom Henry tore England away from the Pope's authority. She was clever, sharp-tongued, and dangerously unwilling to play the meek consort. At first, she was the queen of his dreams. Then, she became the nightmare of his politics. In 1536, whispers in the court became charges adultery, incest with her own brother, and plotting to kill the king. The evidence was laughable, but the trial was a show trial. Within days, Anne was beheaded on Tower Green, her death both a personal betrayal and a state-sanctioned performance. 7 years later, Catherine Howard, wife number 5, walked into a similar trap. Young, vivacious, and naive, she had a past old relationships that enemies used as ammunition. Once the rumors reached Henry, the man who had once called her his rose without a thorn turned cold. Catherine was accused not just of past improprieties, but of current adultery. Whether or not the accusations were true, the sentence was inevitable. Execution. She was barely 20 when the axe fell. The political benefits were clear. Both women were removed at convenient moments, and their deaths served as warnings to anyone who might cross the king. Love, in Henry's hands, was just another weapon in the royal arsenal. But as ruthless as Henry was, his reputation for excess paled compared to the rumors that swirled around one Russian empress, rumors so outlandish they've become immortal in royal scandal lore. Catherine the Great of Russia faced scandalous rumors, false but persistent, that she died while attempting intercourse with a horse. Few monarchs have suffered a posthumous PR disaster quite like Catherine II of Russia. Known in life as a shrewd reformer, military strategist, and cultural patron, Catherine built an empire that spanned continents. But for centuries after her death in 1796, one rumor has overshadowed all of that she died in the middle of an equine encounter. The truth? Catherine died of a stroke in her palace at the age of 67. The horse story appeared almost immediately after, spread gleefully by her enemies in Europe and Russia. It's absurd, impossible, and grotesque. But the fact it stuck tells you something about how scandal operates. The Empress had been dogged by gossip throughout her reign, accused of taking dozens of lovers and keeping a harem of handsome guards. To those who resented a powerful woman ruling in her own right, the horse story was the perfect final insult. Shocking, humiliating, and impossible to prove. The tale travelled fast in an age when satire was a weapon and pornography was political. Pamphlets, caricatures, and whispered court gossip cemented the myth, making Catherine one of history's most slandered rulers. Ironically, the persistence of the lie mirrors her political skill. She dominated the narrative space of her enemies, even if it was for all the wrong reasons. Of course, Catherine's love life did have elements of scandal. She took younger lovers openly, sometimes rewarding them with titles or estates. She played political matchmaking with her own paramours to keep them loyal. But bestiality? Number? That was pure invention. Still, history often remembers the rumour more vividly than the reality. And if Catherine's scandal was built on malicious fantasy, the next emperor's was built on shocking reality incest, public debauchery, and a palace turned into a house of vice. Emperor Caligula was accused of incest with his sisters and turning the imperial palace into a brothel. Caligula didn't just break the rules of Roman imperial decorum, he seemed determined to obliterate them entirely. Taking the throne in 37 AD at the age of 24, he began as a popular ruler. That didn't last. Within months, his reign descended into a fever dream of cruelty, paranoia, and public indecency. Roman historians, never once to miss a scandal, accuse him of incest with his 3 sisters, most infamously Drusilla, whom he allegedly treated as a wife in all but name. When Drusilla died, Caligula declared her a goddess and ordered public mourning as though Rome had lost an empress. To the Senate, it was an alarming display of personal power dressed up as piety. But the rumors didn't stop there. According to sources like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, Caligula transformed parts of the imperial palace into a brothel. Senators' wives and daughters were allegedly coerced into service, with the emperor himself acting as a kind of twisted host. Proceeds from this sordid operation supposedly went into his personal coffers, though it's hard to know where the truth ends and political slander begins. What is certain is that Caligula's public behavior, mocking senators, declaring himself a living god, ordering military campaigns to collect seashells, undermined the dignity of the imperial office. He blurred the line between ruler and spectacle, ensuring that Rome talked about him constantly, if not respectfully. By 41 AD, the Senate and Praetorian Guard had had enough. Caligula was assassinated in a conspiracy, his wife and child murdered alongside him. His scandals lived on, casting his short reign as one of the most debauched in Roman history. And yet, even his palace brothel pales in comparison to the next royal scandal, an entire colony run as a personal money machine, with death and mutilation as the price of profit. King Leopold II of Belgium ran the Congo Free State as his personal colony, where millions were killed, mutilated, or enslaved for rubber profits. If there's a hell for colonial despots, King Leopold II of Belgium has a front row seat. In the late 19th century, Leopold presented himself to Europe as a benevolent monarch with a noble dream: to bring civilization and Christianity to Central Africa. What he actually built was a private empire the Congo Free State owned not by Belgium but by Leopold personally. His target wasn't glory, it was rubber. The Industrial Revolution had created a hunger for it, and the forests of the Congo were full of wild rubber vines. Leopold's agents imposed quotas so brutal they became a death sentence. Villages that failed to meet them faced punishment expeditions, where soldiers burned homes, killed hostages, and mutilated survivors. One of the most infamous practices was the severing of hands, proof for the authorities that bullets hadn't been wasted on hunting. Historians estimate that between 5 and 10 million Congolese died during Leopold's reign over the territory. The atrocities were so widespread that even in the age of imperialism, when colonial cruelty was common, Leopold's Congo became infamous. Missionaries, journalists, and human rights activists exposed the horrors, forcing an international outcry. In 1908, under immense pressure, Leopold surrendered the Congo to the Belgian state. But by then, the damage was irreversible. He had extracted vast personal wealth funding palaces and monuments in Belgium while leaving the Congo devastated. His public image at home was carefully managed, but for much of the world, he became the blueprint of colonial greed and hypocrisy. From the quiet horrors of Leopold's Congo, we moved to another court where destruction came not from imperial conquest, but from the weapons of rumor and slander aimed at a queen. Marie Antoinette was the subject of pornographic pamphlets accusing her of lesbian affairs, orgies, and corruption, many spread by political enemies. Marie Antoinette arrived in France at age 14, a political bride sent from Austria to marry the Dauphin. She was young, foreign, and in the cold, whispering corridors of Versailles that made her dangerous to some and vulnerable to many. By the time she became queen, resentment toward her had already taken root. The real Marie Antoinette was often careless with money and oblivious to the suffering of her subjects, but her enemies needed more than that to bring her down. They used the most potent weapon of the age: scandal. Underground printers churned out libels pamphlets mixing pornography, satire, and political accusation. These painted the queen as a bisexual libertine hosting orgies, seducing noblewomen, and conspiring with lovers to manipulate the king. Illustrations showed her in compromising positions with both men and women, often framed as treasonous acts against France itself. Every expensive gown, Every diamond necklace, every rumor of a masked ball became proof of her decadence. The most famous smear, the affair of the diamond necklace, cemented the public image of a greedy, corrupt queen, even though she was likely innocent. In the salons and streets, these stories became truth long before any trial. By the French Revolution, Madame Deficit was no longer just a queen. She was the symbol of everything rotting in the monarchy. When she faced the Revolutionary Tribunal in 1793, the charges against her included not only treason but incest with her own son, a claim she refused to even dignify with a response. She was executed by guillotine at 37, her head held up to a crowd that had already tried and convicted her years before. But if Marie Antoinette was destroyed by gossip, the next ruler destroyed his own blood in the name of power. Tsar Peter the Great had his own son tortured to death for suspected treason. Peter the Great was a man of vision and violence. He modernized Russia with a ferocity that left no room for half measures. Shipyards, Western dress, a reorganized army. These were his legacy. But so was the chilling fate of his eldest son, Alexei Petrovich. Alexei was not his father's ideal heir. He was reserved, religious, and resistant to Peter's relentless modernization. In Peter's eyes, that wasn't just weakness, it was dangerous. By 1718, Peter had become convinced, or convinced himself, that Alexei was plotting against him. Whether this suspicion was based on solid evidence or paranoia remains debated. Alexei fled Russia for Austria, seeking protection, but Peter lured him back with promises of forgiveness. Once in his father's grip, those promises vanished. Alexei was interrogated, beaten, and subjected to torture, designed to extract a confession. The official verdict was treason. Before his execution could be carried out, Alexei died in prison almost certainly from injuries sustained during the beatings. Peter made no attempt to hide what had happened. In his mind, the stability of the state outweighed paternal instinct. His son had been a liability, and liabilities were removed. The message to the nobility was unmistakable. Loyalty to the Tsar came before loyalty to blood. It was a ruthless lesson, one that would echo through the centuries of Russian autocracy that followed. But as brutal as Peter's decision was, the next emperor's scandal veered away from political necessity into pure, chaotic spectacle. Roman Emperor Elagabalus allegedly prostituted himself in taverns and married a male charioteer. If the Roman Empire had an award for most determined to shock the Senate, Elagabalus would have claimed it before breakfast. Taking the throne at just 14-inch 218 AD, the teenage emperor was already a high priest of the sun god Elagabal, hence the name history remembers him by. His reign would last only 4 years, but those years became a non-stop parade of scandal, sexual spectacle, and bewildered senators wondering what fresh outrage tomorrow would bring. The ancient historians, always happy to sharpen their quills when writing about someone they disliked, painted Elagabalus as a man with no regard for imperial dignity. He allegedly married multiple women, divorced them on a whim, and then, in an act that stunned Roman society, wed a male charioteer named Hierocles. Not content with that, Elagabalus supposedly appeared in public dressed as a bride, referring to himself as the wife of his new husband. The stories didn't stop there. According to the scandal-laden accounts, Elagabalus prostituted himself in the imperial palace, then took it further by frequenting taverns and brothels incognito to sell his own body. Whether these tales were exaggerated political slanders or entirely true is impossible to prove, but they stuck because they fit the image of an emperor more interested in personal pleasure than governing. The Senate, already horrified by his religious policies and his attempts to replace Jupiter with his own god, grew restless. By 222 AD, the Praetorian Guard had had enough. Elagabalus and his mother were assassinated, their bodies dragged through the streets before being thrown into the Tiber. Still, if Elagabalus turned the imperial palace into a stage for personal vice, the next king turned a family matter into one of the most infamous mysteries in English history. Richard III of England was accused of murdering his young nephews, the princes in the Tower, to secure the throne. In 1483, the sudden death of King Edward IV left his 12-year-old son, Edward V, as heir. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, uncle to the boy, was named Lord Protector. Within weeks, Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, were moved into the Tower of London for their safety ahead of the coronation. They were never seen in public again. Soon after, the coronation was cancelled. Parliament declared the princes illegitimate, and Richard took the crown for himself. The boy's fate became the darkest whisper in English politics. Some said Richard ordered them smothered in their beds. Others claimed they were starved or poisoned. No body was ever conclusively identified. Only centuries later would two small skeletons be found beneath a tower staircase, still sparking debate. Richard denied any wrongdoing, and some historians argue the princes could have been killed by other ambitious players in the Wars of the Roses. But the damage was done. The image of the hunchbacked usurper murdering children to steal a crown became cemented in English cultural memory, thanks in no small part to Shakespeare's venomous portrayal. Richard's reign lasted just 2 years, ending with his death at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. Henry Tudor seized the throne, marrying the prince's sister to unite the warring houses. As for the princes themselves, their story became a cautionary tale about the lethal mix of ambition and royal blood. And speaking of ambition unchecked, the next monarch didn't kill to secure an heir. He simply made sure he had as many unofficial ones as possible. King Charles II of England fathered at least 14 illegitimate children but had no legitimate heirs. Charles II, the Merry Monarch, came to power in 1660 after a decade of England's experiment with republicanism. With the return of the crown came a return to parties, pageantry, and Charles's personal specialty romantic entanglements. Tall, charming, and effortlessly witty, Charles collected mistresses the way other kings collected jewels. From actresses like Nell Gwynn to aristocrats like Barbara Villiers, his love life played out in full view of the court. The result? At least 14 acknowledged illegitimate children, and probably more who never made it into the official tally. Each was given a title or estate, making Charles the father of a small army of dukes and earls. What Charles didn't have, however, was a legitimate heir. His marriage to Catherine of Braganza produced no surviving children, and with no son born in wedlock, the Stuart line was in jeopardy. Instead, Charles's younger brother James stood next in succession, a fact that would later plunge England into political crisis. Charles seemed unbothered by the lack of a lawful heir. His court was a theatre of wit, intrigue, and scandal, where mistresses competed for influence and courtiers bet on the king's next romantic conquest. To his subjects, he was a paradox, both a symbol of national restoration and a walking tabloid headline. But if Charles's vices were mostly of the heart, the next ruler's scandal was an act of mass slaughter on a scale that made his own court's excesses look tame. Sultan Ibrahim of the Ottoman Empire drowned 280 concubines after rumors one had slept with another man. If Ottoman court life was a delicate tapestry of intrigue, Sultan Ibrahim, later nicknamed Ibrahim the Mad, ripped it apart with both hands. His reign from 1640 to 1648 was short, chaotic, and steeped in paranoia. The most infamous episode came when whispers reached him that one of his many concubines had been unfaithful. In the harem, even a rumor could be fatal. In Ibrahim's case, it became catastrophic. Without waiting for an investigation, or perhaps not wanting one, he ordered the mass execution of the women in his harem. The number most often cited is staggering: 280 concubines, drowned in the Bosporus in a single day. They were loaded onto boats, taken out into the water, and thrown overboard with stones tied to their bodies. Whether every detail of that number is exact, the massacre was large enough to send shockwaves through the empire. The harem, normally a place of controlled politics and carefully managed relationships, became a site of fear. Ibrahim's erratic behavior, lavish spending, bizarre obsessions, and sudden fits of rage made him deeply unpopular with the court and the janissaries. The concubine drowning became the perfect emblem of his instability. By 1648, the patience of the Ottoman elite had run out. Ibrahim was deposed, imprisoned, and later strangled, ironically, a much quieter death than the spectacle he had inflicted on hundreds of women. If Ibrahim's scandal was a massacre born from paranoia, the next emperor's was an ongoing blood sport, literally. Emperor Commodus staged gladiator fights where he killed wounded soldiers and amputees for sport. For Rome, gladiator games were theatre. For Commodus, they were personal entertainment and a chance to remind everyone who held life and death in his hands. Son of the revered philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius, Commodus inherited the throne in 180 AD. His father's stoicism did not pass down. Commodus fancied himself a great gladiator, and unlike past emperors who kept their participation symbolic, he actually stepped into the arena. Of course, the fights were heavily rigged. His opponents were armed with blunted weapons, or were animals already weakened, or in the most grotesque accounts were injured soldiers and amputees dressed as mythical monsters. The emperor would heroically slay them before cheering crowds. This wasn't just for sport. Commodus demanded payment for each of his appearances, draining the treasury for his own ego. Statues and inscriptions portrayed him as Hercules reborn, club in hand, lion skin draped over his shoulders. To the Senate, it was humiliating. To the Roman public, it was a sideshow that blurred the line between ruler and carnival act. The spectacle ended in 192 AD when a conspiracy, including his mistress, had him strangled in his bath. His death closed a chapter of imperial history where the most dangerous thing in Rome wasn't the barbarians at the gates, but the emperor in the arena. Still, if Commodus's scandal was a grotesque performance, the next queen's was a bedroom drama that questioned the legitimacy of an entire royal bloodline. Queen Isabella II of Spain was notorious for multiple affairs, and rumors claimed none of her children were fathered by her husband. Born into political turmoil, Isabella II of Spain took the throne at just 13. Her reign was marked by constant factional fighting, but her personal life proved just as explosive. Married to her cousin, King Consort Francis of Assisi, Isabella entered a union that was politically convenient but emotionally barren. The couple's incompatibility was so well known that courtiers whispered openly about the king's rumored disinterest in women. Isabella, meanwhile, sought affection elsewhere. Her string of lovers, military officers, politicians, and aristocrats became fodder for Madrid's salons and pamphleteers. The rumors escalated into a claim that not a single one of her children was fathered by her husband. While no DNA tests existed to prove or disprove such whispers, the gossip eroded the monarchy's moral standing. These affairs weren't just personal indulgences, they had political consequences. Factions at court jockeyed to place their favourites in the Queen's bed, hoping for influence through pillow talk. Every child born was the subject of speculation about paternity, adding fuel to Spain's already raging political fires. By 1868, the discontent exploded into revolution. Isabella was forced into exile, her throne given to a foreign prince. She would never again wield real political power, but she remained a figure of fascination and ridicule. And while Isabella's scandal was rooted in whispered bedroom politics, the next one involved literal poison, black magic, and a conspiracy that reached the Sun King himself. Louis XIV's court was rocked by the affair of the poisons, implicating his mistress Madame de Montespan in black magic and poison plots. At the glittering heart of Louis XIV's Versailles, appearances were everything. The Sun King's court was a theatre of gold leaf and etiquette, a place where a raised eyebrow could be as dangerous as a drawn sword. But beneath the chandeliers and silks, something darker festered. In the late 1672, whispers began to circulate about an underworld of poisoners, witches, and fortune-tellers serving France's elite. The scandal would become known as the Affair of the Poisons. It began with the arrest of fortune-teller Catherine Monvoisin-Lavoisin, whose client list read like a who's who of Parisian high society. She was accused of selling love potions, performing black masses, and supplying poisons to clients eager to rid themselves of rivals, spouses, or inconvenient heirs. As investigators dug deeper, the trail of gossip and testimony wound dangerously close to the king's own bedchamber. Madame de Montespan, Louis XIV's chief mistress and mother of several of his children, was named in testimony as having attended occult rituals to secure the king's love. One witness even claimed she had taken part in a black mass where an infant's blood was offered. Whether these claims were true or fabricated by enemies, the accusations were explosive. The king, who had adored Montespan, quietly moved her aside without a public scandal, yet her political power never recovered. Dozens of others were not so lucky. The investigation, part criminal trial and part witch hunt, led to executions, imprisonments, and exiles. The affair of the poisons tarnished the polished image of Versailles, revealing a court where ambition could drive even the most powerful into the shadows of sorcery. But while Louis XIV's court dabbled allegedly in dark magic, the next emperor's scandal was even more disturbing. A retreat stocked not with mistresses, but with children. Emperor Tiberius allegedly kept a retreat on Capri stocked with child prostitutes. Tiberius, the second Roman emperor, inherited Augustus's vast empire and, for a time, ruled competently. But, in his later years, he withdrew from public life, retreating to the island of Capri. What happened there became the subject of Rome's most sordid gossip. According to the historian Suetonius, never shy about a salacious story, Tiberius turned his villa into a secluded pleasure palace, complete with gardens, pools, and a constant supply of sexual partners. The most shocking allegations claimed that many of these were children, taken from their families and trained to gratify the emperor's desires. Whether these accounts were exaggerated by political enemies or entirely accurate is debated. Still, the imagery stuck. Tiberius as a depraved old man, surrounded by a corrupt court of sycophants and victims. The isolation of Capri allowed him to indulge without the eyes of the Senate upon him, but it also fueled Rome's rumor mill. By the time he died in 37 AD, the whispers had turned him into a monstrous figure in the popular imagination. The Capri years stand as a reminder of how absolute power can warp both truth and perception. In Tiberius's case, his retreat became less a symbol of retirement and more a byword for imperial degeneracy. And if Tiberius hid away to indulge in vice, the next king's scandal happened in the open and involved a crime that would embarrass an entire royal family. King Farouk of Egypt was caught stealing a valuable pocket watch from the Shah of Iran. King Farouk's reign over Egypt from 1936 to 1952 was a study in contradictions. Handsome and charming, he cultivated an image of regal sophistication, yet his personal behavior often undermined it. Known for his voracious appetite for food, women, and luxury goods, Farouk also had a peculiar habit: kleptomania. At the 1943 wedding of the Shah of Iran, Farouk attended as a distinguished guest. The event was a grand display of royal wealth and diplomacy. But sometime during the celebrations, the Shah's prized pocket watch, a gift of immense value, vanished. It was later discovered in Farouk's possession. Whether he took it as a joke, a souvenir, or simply because he couldn't resist, the theft became a whispered scandal among royal circles. Farouk's reputation for sticky fingers wasn't limited to this one incident. He was rumored to have stolen from hotels, shops, and even from other heads of state. Combined with his excessive spending, gambling, and political incompetence, these stories painted a picture of a monarch dangerously out of touch with the dignity of his office. By 1952, a military coup swept him from power, replacing the monarchy with a republic. Farouk went into exile, living a life of fading grandeur, his reign remembered as much for its petty scandals as its political failures. And while Farouk's theft was a small crime with a big public impact, the next king's downfall would be a sprawling mixture of lovers, extravagance, and the quiet collapse of a monarchy. King Juan Carlos I of Spain was forced to abdicate amid revelations of secret lovers, elephant hunting trips during a recession, and offshore accounts. For much of his reign, King Juan Carlos I was seen as the monarch who saved Spanish democracy after Franco's dictatorship. Charismatic, approachable, and politically savvy, he seemed untouchable. But as the decades rolled on, the shine wore off and the cracks became chasms. The turning point came in 2012, during Spain's crippling economic crisis. While unemployment soared and families lost homes, the king was discovered on a lavish elephant hunting trip in Botswana. The trip itself was bad enough. The revelation that he had gone in the company of a glamorous German businesswoman, Corinna Larson, rumored to be his mistress, made it worse. The optics were catastrophic. A monarch living in excess while his people suffered. Then came the financial scandals. Investigations revealed secret offshore accounts and undeclared funds allegedly tied to shady business deals with foreign governments. One particularly damaging report claimed he had received millions from Saudi Arabia. The image of the humble king who walked among his people evaporated overnight. Public outrage grew so intense that in 2014, Juan Carlos abdicated in favor of his son, Felipe VI. Even in retirement, the scandals continued to haunt him. In 2020, facing multiple investigations, he fled to self-imposed exile in the United Arab Emirates, a symbolic fall from grace for the man once hailed as Spain's democratic savior. If Juan Carlos's scandal mixed political betrayal with romantic intrigue, the next queen's disgrace was purely personal and so public that she was banned from her own coronation. Queen Caroline of Brunswick, wife of George IV, was barred from her own coronation due to accusations of adultery. When George IV ascended the British throne in 1820, his relationship with his wife, Caroline of Brunswick, was already a train wreck. Their marriage had been arranged for political reasons, and from the moment they met, they loathed each other. George found Caroline crude and ill-mannered. Caroline found George pompous and repulsive. They separated almost immediately after the birth of their only child, Princess Charlotte. For years, Caroline lived abroad, making little effort to hide her romantic liaisons. By the time George became king, she had gathered a reputation for scandal, particularly for her close relationship with an Italian servant, Bartolomeo Pergami. George, determined to rid himself of her once and for all, launched the infamous Pains and Penalties Bill to strip her of the title of Queen and dissolve the marriage on grounds of adultery. The trial was a public sensation, with witnesses paraded before Parliament to testify about Caroline's alleged affairs. Although the bill failed, the smear campaign had already done its work. When George's coronation arrived in 1821, Caroline appeared at Westminster Abbey demanding entry. The doors were literally shut in her face. Humiliated before the nation, she died just 3 weeks later. Her last request to have the injured Queen of England inscribed on her coffin was a final jab at the husband who had publicly destroyed her. From marital humiliation, we turn to imperial tragedy, where love ended not in scandalous divorce, but in mysterious death. Emperor Hadrian's love affair with the young Greek Antinous ended in scandal when Antinous drowned mysteriously in the Nile. Hadrian, the Roman emperor best remembered for his wall across Britain, was also known for his love of Greek culture, and one young Greek man in particular, Antinous. The two were inseparable, traveling together across the empire. Antinous appeared in art, coinage, and the emperor's personal entourage, his beauty immortalized in marble. In 130 AD, during a voyage along the Nile, tragedy struck. Antinous drowned under mysterious circumstances. Ancient sources offered multiple explanations: accident, suicide, even ritual sacrifice. Rumors spread that Hadrian himself had orchestrated it to prolong his own life through occult means, or that Antinous had willingly given his life in some mystical rite. Whatever the truth, Hadrian's grief was overwhelming. He deified Antinous, founding the city of Antinopolis near the site of his death, and commissioning statues of him across the empire. This public display of love and the unprecedented act of deifying a non-imperial, non-relative scandalized many Romans, who viewed it as an unseemly obsession. For Hadrian, however, the mourning became a political statement as much as a personal one. Antinous became a symbol of youth, beauty, and imperial favor, his image surviving for centuries in art and architecture. But beneath the marble ideal lay a story that Romans whispered about in tones of both fascination and discomfort. And while Hadrian's scandal was steeped in mystery and mourning, the next king's whispers would center not on loss, but on the intimate relationships he formed with his own male favorites. King James VI and I was widely rumored to have intimate relationships with male favorites like Robert Carr and George Villiers. James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England in 1603, liked to style himself as a wise, divinely appointed ruler. And yet, his court quickly developed a reputation for being less about sober governance and more about lavish patronage of certain very handsome young men. The most famous of these favourites were Robert Carr, Earl of Somerset, and George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. The relationships, whatever their precise nature, were intensely close. James wrote Villiers letters dripping with affection, calling him my sweet child and wife, and my only sweet and dear child. He showered both Car and Villiers with lands, titles, and influence, often to the irritation of the nobility and Parliament, who saw the favourites as unqualified interlopers. Political scandal followed in the wake of this personal favouritism. Car became embroiled in the infamous Overbury affair, a murder by poison conspiracy that rocked the court. Villiers, meanwhile, accumulated extraordinary power, shaping foreign and domestic policy and becoming a lightning rod for public resentment. Critics accused James of neglecting the affairs of state in favour of indulging his favourites both financially and emotionally. Whether James's attachments were sexual or merely intense friendships remains debated, but in the charged political atmosphere of the time, perception was as damaging as fact. The image of a king enthralled by beautiful young men, granting them near total sway over royal affairs, lingered long after his death. From royal favour to papal excess, our next scandal leaves the court of England and steps directly into the Vatican, where the Pope himself made sin into spectacle. Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, held infamous orgies in the Vatican and arranged political marriages for his illegitimate children. The papacy is supposed to be a model of piety. Under Pope Alexander VI, it became a dynasty of vice. Born Rodrigo Borgia, Alexander ascended to the papal throne in 1492 after a campaign of open bribery. Once there, he ruled not as a shepherd of souls, but as the head of a powerful, ruthless family. Alexander fathered several children despite the vow of celibacy, including the notorious Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia. Rather than hide them, he flaunted them, using their marriages as tools to build alliances. The Vatican became less a holy seat than a family palace. Diplomacy was conducted through banquets, arranged unions, and according to his many enemies, events of far more scandalous nature. Rumours of Vatican orgies swirled, the most infamous being the Banquet of Chestnuts, where courtesans and noblewomen allegedly danced nude before the Pope and his guests. Whether embellished or entirely fabricated by his detractors, such tales stuck because they fit the Borgia image: beautiful, corrupt, and untouchable. Alexander's papacy blurred every boundary between sacred and profane, making the Vatican a centre of both spiritual authority and whispered scandal. His reign left such a mark that the name Borgia still conjures images of poison, power, and moral rot. If Alexander's intrigue relied on marriage alliances, the next Queen's scandal was pure bloodshed, an orchestrated massacre that changed the course of France. Catherine de' Medici was accused of orchestrating the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre to secure her family's power. In August 1572, Paris was a city on edge. The marriage of Catherine's daughter, Margaret of Valois, to the Protestant Henry of Navarre was meant to heal France's religious divide. Instead, it became the opening act of one of the bloodiest episodes in French history. Days after the wedding, Protestant leaders gathered in Paris were attacked. The violence spread like wildfire. Over the next weeks, thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered not just in Paris, but across France. While Catholic factions claimed the killings were spontaneous uprisings, many pointed to Catherine de' Medici as the mastermind, accusing her of using the wedding as a trap to eliminate Protestant influence at court. Catherine's reputation for political cunning made the accusation believable. She had navigated decades of war and intrigue, always placing her children's interests first. Whether she orchestrated the massacre or simply failed to stop it, her legacy was sealed in blood. Protestant propaganda painted her as a venomous queen mother, manipulating her weak sons and pulling the strings of a kingdom drenched in sectarian hatred. The massacre not only deepened France's religious wars, but also cemented Catherine's image as one of history's most ruthless political survivors. And from the deadly politics of French court life, we turn to an emperor's scandal so brazen it reads like a tavern tale, an empress competing in a sexual endurance contest. Emperor Claudius's wife, Messalina, allegedly challenged a prostitute to a sex marathon and won with 25 men in one night. In the annals of Roman scandal, Valeria Messalina, third wife of Emperor Claudius, stands out as a legend of excess. Ancient sources like Juvenal and Pliny the Elder didn't merely accuse her of infidelity, they painted her as a sexual juggernaut whose appetite knew no bounds. The most infamous tale claims she once challenged Rome's most celebrated prostitute to a contest who could sleep with more men in a single night. According to the storytellers, Messalina won by a staggering margin of 25 partners. Whether this was fact, propaganda, or grotesque exaggeration is still debated. What is certain is that Messalina wielded her sexuality and position for political gain. She used lovers to gather influence, reward allies, and destroy rivals. Her enemies in the Senate despised her power, and her notoriety among the people grew until it became dangerous to her survival. Eventually, her intrigues caught up with her. In 48 AD, while Claudius was away from Rome, Messalina allegedly staged a public marriage to one of her lovers, Gaius Silius. Whether it was a coup attempt or a reckless romantic gesture, it was her undoing. Claudius, informed of the betrayal, ordered her execution without a formal trial. Messalina's legend, part femme fatale, part cautionary tale, endured in Roman gossip for generations. Her supposed marathon became shorthand for sexual excess at the heart of imperial Rome. From sexual contests to medieval cruelty, our next scandal features a king who punished his mother's lover in one of the most brutal ways imaginable. King Louis I of Hungary had his mother's lover executed by having him torn apart by horses. Royal executions were often grimly efficient, but Louis I of Hungary, known as Louis the Great, presided over one that was as theatrical as it was horrific. The victim was no political rival or rebel leader, it was his mother's lover. The affair itself was scandalous enough in a medieval court, where family honor was bound tightly to political legitimacy. But when the relationship came to light, Louis turned it into an opportunity for a very public demonstration of his authority. The punishment chosen was one of the most brutal available: execution by quartering. 4 horses were harnessed to the condemned man, one for each limb. At a signal, they were driven in opposite directions, tearing the body apart. The method was meant to be both a deterrent and a spectacle, leaving no doubt about the king's willingness to enforce moral and dynastic discipline. In Louis's court, the execution reaffirmed the sanctity of the royal family's reputation. But to his enemies, it was another example of royal cruelty wrapped in the guise of justice. This act became part of his legacy, overshadowing his otherwise notable reign as a warrior king who expanded Hungary's influence. From Hungary's brutal punishments, we turn to Sweden, where a king's downfall came not from violence, but from whispered rumors about his mind and morals. King Gustav IV Adolf of Sweden was deposed partly due to rumors of mental instability and sexual perversions. When Gustav IV Adolf ascended the Swedish throne in 1792, expectations were high. He was young, energetic, and heir to a kingdom navigating the turbulent waters of Napoleonic Europe. But as his reign unfolded, optimism gave way to suspicion. Gustav's political decisions were erratic. His staunch opposition to Napoleon, while principled, isolated Sweden diplomatically and economically. Military setbacks, especially the disastrous loss of Finland to Russia in 1809, shattered his reputation. Yet political failure alone might not have ended his reign. What truly undermined him were the whispers. Courtiers and political rivals began spreading rumors that the king was mentally unstable. Stories circulated about strange behavior, obsessive religious views, and inappropriate conduct. Some went further, hinting at sexual perversions, though the exact nature of these claims was left deliberately vague, allowing imagination to fill in the most damning possibilities. By 1809, a coup was underway. Gustav was arrested and forced to abdicate, replaced by his uncle. He spent the rest of his life in exile under various aliases, wandering Europe as a king without a kingdom. The allegations about his mental state and morals were never proven, but they became an enduring part of his story, a reminder of how swiftly public perception could turn a monarch into an outcast. And if Gustav's fall was engineered by rumor and political failure, the next king's scandal was less about whispers and more about an obsession so consuming it interfered with his ability to rule. King Christian VII of Denmark was obsessed with masturbation to the point it impaired his royal duties. Christian VII ascended to the Danish throne in 1766 at the age of 17, and from the beginning his reign was marked by erratic behavior. Contemporary accounts describe him as intelligent but deeply unstable, given to sudden mood swings, fits of paranoia, and an almost compulsive self-destructive streak. One particularly notorious detail gleefully repeated by foreign diplomats and satirists was his alleged obsession with masturbation. This wasn't whispered innuendo. It became a defining part of his public reputation, used by political opponents to frame him as unfit to rule. Ministers complained that he neglected council meetings and state affairs, disappearing for long stretches, sometimes retreating to his private chambers during important events. For a court obsessed with decorum, it was more than embarrassing, it was destabilizing. His mental health struggles seemed to worsen over time, possibly pointing to schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder. While his personal habits became the subject of gossip, real political power began to slip from his hands. Court intrigue flourished, culminating in the rise of his physician, Johann Friedrich Struensee, who effectively governed Denmark for 2 years. The relationship between Christian, Struensee, and Queen Caroline Matilda would soon produce a scandal of its own, but that was still to come. Christian remained king in name only until his death in 1808. His reign remembered less for policy and more for the salacious details that court gossip immortalized. If Christian's scandal was about self-obsession, the next queen's was about a mental collapse so public it transformed her from monarch to cautionary tale. Queen Maria I of Portugal was declared insane after public breakdowns, possibly triggered by guilt over executing political rivals. Maria I of Portugal began her reign in 1777 as a deeply devout and conscientious ruler. She was the first woman to govern Portugal in her own right, known for piety and generosity. But in the years that followed, her mental stability began to unravel dramatically and in full public view. Her decline seemed to accelerate after the death of her husband, Pedro III, and her confessor, who was also a close advisor. Religious guilt gnawed at her, particularly over the execution of political prisoners early in her reign. Observers noted her increasing paranoia, severe depression, and periods of uncontrollable weeping. In 1792, her condition reached a breaking point. She began screaming during church services, hallucinating and exhibiting erratic behavior that horrified the court. The diagnosis was insanity, and she was declared unfit to rule. Her son, the future John VI, was appointed Prince Regent. Maria spent her final years under constant care, at times restrained for her own safety. Her illness, though tragic, became a political tool used by some to discredit her earlier policies and by others to justify the regency. When she died in 1816, Portugal mourned not just the queen she had once been, but the stability her mental decline had taken with it. If Maria's scandal was born of a mind in torment, the next king's was an act so morbidly theatrical, it reads like a Gothic fairy tale. King Pedro I of Portugal exhumed his mistress Inês de Castro and crowned her corpse as queen. Pedro I of Portugal's love affair with Inês de Castro was passionate, political, and deadly. Inês, the lady-in-waiting to Pedro's wife, became his mistress, and, after his wife's death, his partner in all but name. But the Portuguese court saw her as a threat. Her family's political ambitions were dangerous. In 1355, while Pedro's father, King Afonso IV, still ruled, Inês was executed in front of her own children. When Pedro became king in 1357, grief turned into vengeance. He hunted down and executed the men who had killed Inês. Then came the act that would etch his name into legend. According to chroniclers, he had Inês's body exhumed, dressed in royal robes, and placed on the throne. Courtiers were allegedly ordered to kneel and kiss the hand of the dead queen. Whether every detail is true or embellished, the spectacle captured the imagination of poets and painters for centuries. In Portugal, the love story of Pedro and Inês became a national tragedy, part romance, part horror. Pedro's gesture was interpreted as both an act of undying devotion and a chilling display of royal power over life, death, and memory. And if Pedro's scandal turned the royal court into a Gothic tableau, the next emperor's drama was a cold, calculated political divorce. Napoleon Bonaparte divorced Empress Josephine because she couldn't give him an heir, despite his own infidelities. Napoleon and Josephine were the ultimate power couple until they weren't. When they married in 1796, the young general was head over heels, sending her letters so fevered they practically smoked off the page. But as Napoleon's power grew, so did his ambitions. By the time he crowned himself Emperor of the French in 1804, his mind was already fixed on producing a legitimate heir to secure his dynasty. Josephine, 6 years his senior, had children from her first marriage, but none with Napoleon. After years of trying, it became clear she would bear no more. While Josephine remained devoted, Napoleon's attention wandered not just politically, but romantically. He took lovers across Europe, fathering at least one illegitimate child, yet still framed Josephine's inability to produce an heir as a fatal flaw. In 1809, the imperial couple's divorce was staged with all the pomp of a state ceremony. They read public declarations of mutual affection, but the underlying reality was cold strategy. Napoleon would soon marry Marie-Louise of Austria, a teenage Habsburg princess who quickly produced the much-desired son, Napoleon II. Josephine retreated to her beloved Château de Malmaison, where she maintained a cordial relationship with Napoleon until her death in 1814. For the French public, their divorce was a melancholy end to a romance that had begun in passion and ended in political calculus. From a coldly calculated divorce, we move to a Polish king whose scandal was rooted not in love, but in torture chambers. King Sigismund III of Poland imprisoned and tortured nobles who questioned his authority. Sigismund III, Wasa's reign over the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from 1587 to 1632 was marked by ambitious plans and deep political divisions. As king, he was determined to strengthen royal authority in a realm famous for its powerful, independently minded nobility. That meant conflict was inevitable. When nobles opposed his policies, particularly his attempts to centralize power and push Catholic dominance in a largely tolerant state, Sigismund responded with more than political maneuvering. He resorted to imprisonment, confiscation of estates, and outright torture to silence dissenters. Those who resisted too strongly found themselves rotting in cells or enduring brutal interrogations until their political will, and sometimes their bodies, broke. Such repression clashed with the Commonwealth's cherished tradition of golden liberty, where nobles were supposed to have the right to openly challenge the monarch. Sigismund's heavy-handed methods alienated large swaths of the political elite, contributing to rebellions and civil unrest. His reign left a legacy of deep mistrust between crown and nobility. If Sigismund's scandal was about crushing his enemies, the next emperor's was about a crown prince who didn't survive to inherit his life, ending in a tragedy tinged with romance and mystery. Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria's son, Crown Prince Rudolf, died in a suspected murder-suicide pact with his teenage mistress. The Habsburg court of the late 19th century projected an image of rigid formality and moral rectitude. But behind the scenes, Crown Prince Rudolf, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth, was a restless, troubled figure. Intelligent and progressive-minded, Rudolf clashed with his conservative father and found little comfort in his arranged marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium. In 1889, the 30-year-old crown prince retreated to his hunting lodge at Meerling with his 7-year-old mistress, Baroness Mary Vetsera. The next morning, both were found dead. The official story was murky. Some claimed Rudolf shot Mary before turning the gun on himself. Others whispered of political assassination disguised as tragedy. The Habsburg court moved quickly to contain the scandal. Mary's body was buried in secret, and the Catholic Church, usually strict about suicide, allowed Rudolf a royal burial after officially ruling him mentally unfit at the time of death. Still, the story of the Meerling incident captured Europe's imagination, inspiring plays, novels, and films. For Franz Joseph, the loss was devastating both personally and politically. Rudolf's death left the empire without a clear liberal heir, pushing the monarchy further toward the conservatism that would define its twilight years. And from the romanticized tragedy of Meerling, we move to a Norwegian king nearly undone by the most dangerous force in monarchy gossip about royal cover-ups. King Håkon VII of Norway was nearly toppled by accusations of covering up royal family affairs. Håkon VII, the Danish prince who became Norway's first independent monarch in 1905, built a reputation as a symbol of unity and quiet dignity. But even the most upright kings are not immune to scandal, especially when family secrets are involved. During his reign, whispers began to circulate about alleged romantic entanglements within the royal family, some involving prominent courtiers and aristocrats. The details were hazy, but the rumors had one explosive claim: that Håkon personally intervened to cover up these affairs to protect the monarchy's image. In an era when Norway was still consolidating its national identity, such allegations struck at the heart of royal legitimacy. Political opponents and a hungry press saw an opportunity. The accusations painted Håkon not as a wise patriarch, but as a man willing to manipulate justice to shield his relatives from public shame. Though no solid proof emerged, the persistence of the rumors was damaging enough to erode trust. Courtiers scrambled to project an image of stability, while Håkon kept a stony silence, hoping the storm would pass. It eventually did, and Håkon retained his throne until his death in 1957, beloved once again by his people. But the episode left a lesson lingering in the royal halls. Sometimes the threat isn't the scandal itself, but the perception that the crown will always protect its own, no matter the cost. If Hakon's troubles came from whispered family indiscretions, the next Tsar's scandal was an act of violence that left his own blood staining the palace floor. Tsar Ivan IV, the Terrible, killed his own son in a fit of rage. Ivan IV of Russia earned his nickname, the Terrible, not just from his wars and tyrannical rule, but from moments of personal brutality that stunned even his own court. The most infamous occurred in November 1581. In a heated argument with his eldest son, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, the Tsar struck him on the head with his scepter. The blow proved fatal. Accounts suggest the quarrel began over the treatment of the Tsar's pregnant daughter-in-law. Ivan IV, suspecting impropriety or disobedience, had assaulted her, causing a miscarriage. His son, outraged, confronted him, leading to the fatal strike. The scene that followed became iconic in Russian history. The Tsar reportedly cradled his dying son in horror and grief, realizing too late the enormity of what he had done. With the heir dead, the succession passed to Ivan's second son, Fyodor, who was physically and mentally weak, ushering in a period of instability that would later spiral into the time of troubles. In art and memory, the moment became a symbol of Ivan's volatile nature, a ruler capable of grand state building, yet equally capable of destroying his own future in a burst of uncontrollable anger. And if Ivan's tragedy was a single fatal blow, the next king's scandal was a quieter but no less infamous indulgence, one that required custom furniture. King Edward VII had a custom-made chair for sexual liaisons with mistresses at a Paris brothel. Before becoming king, Edward VII, known as Bertie to his friends and family, was the playboy prince of Europe. His love of fine food, good cigars, and beautiful women was legendary. But one detail from his Parisian escapades became the stuff of decadent lore. In the famous brothel Le Chabanais, Edward reportedly commissioned a custom-built chair designed for sexual encounters. The contraption allowed him to indulge in athletic pursuits without the inconvenience of full physical strain, a testament both to his fondness for elaborate pleasures and to his expanding waistline. The chair became an icon of belle époque gossip, a symbol of how royals could indulge their desires with engineering flair. Edward's Paris visits were hardly discreet. The French press winked at his antics, and London society whispered in fascination. Yet despite the scandal, Edward's charm and affable nature shielded him from lasting damage. When he finally became king in 1901, he managed to pivot from playboy to respected monarch, modernizing the navy and strengthening alliances. Still, his Paris chair remained an enduring piece of salacious trivia, a reminder that the line between statesman and scandal maker can be very, very thin. From Edward's engineered pleasures, we move to a Mexican emperor whose romantic escapades were less mechanical and more rumor-laden. Emperor Maximilian II of Mexico was rumored to have fathered children with prostitutes, while Empress Carlota was in Europe. Maximilian II's short reign as Emperor of Mexico, 1864-1867, was already precarious, propped up by French military support and rejected by large swaths of the Mexican population. But while political instability gnawed at his empire, personal rumors added another layer of scandal. When Empress Carlota traveled to Europe in a desperate bid to secure more backing for their fragile throne, Maximilian remained in Mexico City. It was during this period that gossip began to swirl. The emperor, lonely or simply opportunistic, was allegedly spending nights with prostitutes, and not discreetly. The most salacious version claimed that he fathered illegitimate children with these women, some of whom were quietly paid off or disappeared from public life. Whether true or the invention of political enemies, the rumors struck a nerve. Maximilian had cultivated an image as a liberal, moral ruler, a man above the excesses of court decadence. The idea that he was indulging in carnal pleasures while his wife fought to save their crown undermined that image completely. By the time Carlota returned, she was already descending into mental collapse, her hopes for imperial survival shattered. Maximilian, soon captured by Republican forces, was executed in 1867. His alleged romantic misadventures were a minor footnote compared to his political downfall, but they added an extra sting to his legacy as a monarch out of place, out of power, and if the whispers were true, unable to keep his personal life from bleeding into scandal. From Imperial Mexico, we head to a Balkan king whose vices were measured not in whispers, but in smoke and contraband. King Zog I of Albania smoked hundreds of cigarettes a day and was accused of smuggling opium. King Zogavar of Albania reigned from 1928 until 1939, a figure as colourful as his country's turbulent politics. Known for his sharp suits, elaborate hospitality, and a fondness for carrying a pistol at all times, Zog cultivated an image of a modernizing strongman. But behind the image lay a few habits that raised eyebrows far beyond Albania's borders. First was his legendary smoking. Reports claimed he consumed between 200 and 300 cigarettes per day, a staggering figure that became a running joke among diplomats. But while chain smoking could be dismissed as eccentricity, other allegations were far more serious. Rumors swirled that Zog was involved in smuggling operations, particularly opium, which passed through Albania's ports on its way to European markets. Though concrete evidence was thin, the accusations were sticky enough to become part of his international reputation. His enemies, both domestic and foreign, painted him as a monarch who blurred the lines between ruler and criminal boss. When Italy invaded Albania in 1939, Zog fled into exile, carrying vast sums of gold. He never regained his throne, spending the rest of his life moving between luxury hotels and private estates. The cigarette anecdotes remained light-hearted, but the whispers about opium smuggling ensured that his name carried a faint, smoky trace of criminal intrigue. From a king accused of smuggling, we move to one whose scandal lay in the perception that he was too close, perhaps far too close, to certain men in his court. King Charles I of England was accused of homosexual affairs and lavish corruption before being executed. Charles I's reign, 1625-1649, was a slow-motion collision between the Crown and Parliament. But alongside the constitutional crisis came personal attacks aimed at his morality. His close relationships with male courtiers, particularly George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, sparked rumours of intimacy beyond friendship. Whether these accusations were based on truth or political malice, they became ammunition for his critics. At the same time, Charles's spending habits and love of opulence fueled charges of corruption. He poured money into court entertainments, elaborate art commissions, and personal luxuries, even as the kingdom's finances grew strained. Parliament used these personal criticisms to frame Charles as a monarch out of touch with his people and dangerously indulgent. When the English Civil War broke out, such perceptions helped justify rebellion in the eyes of his opponents. Captured, tried, and convicted of high treason, Charles went to the scaffold in January 1649. His execution was a political earthquake, but for his enemies, it was also the symbolic end of a corrupt, morally suspect monarchy. And from a king executed for political and personal failings, we turn to another monarch whose scandal was measured not in whispers of treason, but in the dozens of children he fathered outside of wedlock. Henry I of England kept dozens of illegitimate children, but lost his only legitimate male heir in the White Ship disaster. Henry I, the youngest son of William the Conqueror, ruled England with a mix of administrative skill and personal indulgence. He was a master of consolidating royal power, but when it came to his private life, restraint was not his style. Chroniclers credited him with fathering more than 20 illegitimate children, an astonishing number even by medieval royal standards. These offspring were scattered across noble households, often used as political pawns through advantageous marriages. Yet for all his fecundity, Henry had only one legitimate son, William Adelin, born to his queen, Matilda of Scotland. This single heir was the keystone of Henry's dynastic plans. But fate, in the form of drunken sailors and a treacherous sea, had other ideas. In 1120, William set sail for England aboard the White Ship, the pride of the royal fleet. The voyage began with revelry, plenty of wine, and a boastful crew confident they could outpace the king's own vessel. Not long after leaving port, the ship struck a submerged rock. It sank quickly in the freezing waters of the English Channel, killing nearly everyone aboard, including William. The loss was catastrophic. With no male heir, Henry's succession plans collapsed, plunging England into a period of instability known as the Anarchy after his death. For all his children, legitimate authority could only pass through one now gone. From a king undone by the sea, we move to a French monarch whose scandal was whispered not on the waves, but in the bedchamber. Louis XIII of France was plagued by rumors of intimacy with male favorites instead of his wife. Louis XIII ruled France from 1610 to 1643, a reign dominated by court intrigue and the towering political presence of Cardinal Richelieu. But in the salons of Paris and the back corridors of the Louvre, the king's personal life was a constant source of gossip. Married to Anne of Austria, Louis's relationship with his queen was famously strained. They spent long periods apart and failed to produce an heir for over 2 decades, a delay that fueled speculation. At the same time, Louis's intense relationships with certain male courtiers raised eyebrows. His favorites, notably Charles d'Albert, Duke of Luynes, enjoyed extraordinary closeness and influence, leading many to suspect that the king's affections were not purely platonic. Whether the rumors were true or the product of malicious court politics, they gained traction because they fit the narrative of a king emotionally absent from his marriage. It wasn't until 1638, after 23 years of wedlock, that Anne gave birth to the future Louis XIV, ending the whispers about the succession, though not necessarily about the king's private preferences. Louis's guarded nature and preference for a small, trusted circle meant the truth was never widely known. But the image of a monarch who confided more in male companions than in his queen became an enduring part of his legacy. From the reserved French king, we turn to a Swedish queen whose abdication was as scandalous as the rumors about her lovers. Queen Christina of Sweden abdicated, converted to Catholicism, and lived surrounded by rumors of affairs with both men and women. Queen Christina was an unconventional monarch from the start. Ascending the Swedish throne at just 6 years old in 1632, she grew into a fiercely independent ruler with a passion for the arts, philosophy, and intellectual debate. But her refusal to marry and her open disdain for the traditional role of a queen sparked endless speculation. In 1654, Christina stunned Europe by abdicating the throne, citing exhaustion and an aversion to marriage. Her decision was shocking enough, but what came next cemented her place in scandal history. She converted from Lutheranism to Catholicism, an unthinkable move for a ruler of staunchly Protestant Sweden. After relocating to Rome, Christina lived as a patron of the arts, surrounding herself with a circle of intellectuals, artists, and rumored lovers of both sexes. Her close relationships with certain female companions in particular fueled persistent gossip. Some contemporaries saw her as a libertine. Others admired her as a woman who refused to be defined by gendered expectations. Christina's wardrobe, often blending masculine and feminine elements, only added to her mystique. She remained a political player, dabbling in papal intrigues and European diplomacy, but it was her personal life, lived unapologetically on her own terms, that ensured her name would be spoken with a mix of admiration and scandal for centuries. From Christina's cosmopolitan freedom, we move to a Russian Tsar whose erratic punishments and rumoured instability alienated his own nobility. Emperor Paul I of Russia had nobles flogged for minor offences and was rumoured to suffer from insanity. Paul I's reign 1796–1801 was short, volatile, and deeply unsettling for Russia's aristocracy. The son of Catherine the Great, Paul inherited the throne at 42 and immediately set about undoing many of his mother's policies. He was obsessed with military discipline, Prussian-style order, and absolute obedience not just from soldiers, but from the nobility itself. This obsession translated into punishments that were both petty and brutal. Nobles who failed to follow court etiquette or military regulations to the letter could find themselves stripped of privileges, exiled, or, in some cases, publicly flogged. The idea that a member of the aristocracy supposedly untouchable could be beaten like a common criminal sent shockwaves through St. Petersburg's glittering salons. Rumours soon spread that Paul's behaviour was not just authoritarian, but unhinged. His sudden rages, erratic decrees, and paranoia about assassination fed whispers that the emperor was mentally unstable. He micromanaged the army's uniforms down to the colour of buttons, obsessed over symbolic details, and reversed policy decisions seemingly on a whim. In 1801, a group of disgruntled nobles and army officers decided they had endured enough. They broke into his chambers and confronted him, hoping to force his abdication. The confrontation turned violent, and Paul was strangled, a coup that brought his son Alexander I to the throne. The manner of his death, like his reign, became part of a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power in the hands of a man who might not be fully in control of himself. From Paul's erratic rule, we turn to an Italian king whose scandal wasn't about public cruelty, but about whispers of affairs with both men and women that helped doom his reign. King Umberto II of Italy was accused of having affairs with both men and women, leading to his short reign. Umberto II, nicknamed the May King for his brief reign of just over a month in 1946, inherited the throne at a moment of crisis. Italy, fresh from the disasters of Mussolini's alliance with Nazi Germany, was on the brink of abolishing its monarchy. But if the political winds were already against him, Umberto's personal life gave his opponents even more ammunition. Whispers about his sexuality had circulated for years. Rumours claimed that Umberto engaged in affairs with both men and women, an indiscretion that, in conservative post-war Italy, was more than enough to tarnish a monarch's public image. While his marriage to Queen Marie José produced children, it did little to silence the gossip. Republican newspapers and political rivals seized on these stories, framing Umberto as a man more interested in private pleasures than in leading a battered nation through reconstruction. Whether the claims were true or politically weaponized, they stuck and combined with deep public resentment toward the monarchy as an institution, they sealed his fate. In June 1946, a referendum abolished the monarchy. Umberto went into exile in Portugal, never setting foot in Italy again. His month-long reign remains one of the shortest in modern European history, remembered as much for the gossip surrounding his personal life as for the political collapse it accompanied. From Umberto's whispered scandals, we move to an emperor of China whose path to power was shadowed by the suspicion of patricide. Emperor Yongzheng of China allegedly poisoned his father to seize the throne. The Yongzheng emperor, who ruled China from 1722 to 1735, was a capable, reform-minded monarch, efficient, diligent, and determined to strengthen imperial authority. Yet his rise to power was clouded by one of the most persistent rumors in Qing dynasty history, that he murdered his own father, the Kangxi Emperor, to take the throne. The official account was straightforward. Kangxi died of natural causes, and Yongzheng, his fourth son, succeeded him according to imperial decree. But whispers told a darker story. Some claimed that Yongzheng altered his father's will, changing the named heir from another brother to himself. Others alleged he administered poison to hasten Kangxi's death. Part of the suspicion came from the speed with which Yongzheng moved after Kangxi's passing, swiftly consolidating power, sidelining rivals, and imprisoning or executing brothers who might contest his claim. His reign's heavy-handed control over political discourse, including censorship and suppression of dissent, only fed the conspiracy theories. Though historians largely dismiss the patricide claim as unfounded, the rumor endured, in part because it aligned with the Chinese cultural fascination with palace intrigue and fratricidal succession struggles. In popular culture, Yongzheng is often portrayed as the cold, calculating son who betrayed the ultimate Confucian virtue, filial piety. And if Yongzheng's scandal rested in whispers of murder within the family, the next emperor's notoriety was about breaking every traditional boundary of marriage itself. Emperor Nero married two men in public ceremonies, one as the bride and one as the groom. Nero's reign over Rome, 54-68 AD, was already a theatre of excess, cruelty, and bizarre spectacle. But even by his standards, his approach to marriage was unconventional. The Roman Empire had strict social norms about matrimony. It was supposed to be between a man and a woman, ideally producing heirs to secure the family line. Nero treated those norms as optional guidelines at best. The first scandal came when he married a young man named Pythagoras. In this union, Nero took the role of the bride, reportedly wearing a veil and going through the ceremony in front of guests. Later, he flipped the script by marrying another male partner, Sporus, this time in the role of the groom. The Sporus relationship was especially infamous because Nero had the boy castrated to resemble his deceased wife, Poppaea Sabina, whom Nero had allegedly killed in a fit of rage. These unions were not private affairs hidden from the public eye. They were stage spectacles, complete with wedding banquets, processions, and formal vows. For the Roman elite, the ceremonies blurred the line between imperial authority and personal theatre, reinforcing the idea that Nero saw himself as an actor-emperor first and a statesman second. The marriages shocked traditionalists, infuriated moralists, and amused the masses who came to see Nero's reign as a grotesque carnival. By the time he committed suicide in 68 AD, the image of Nero in wedding garb, sometimes the blushing bride, sometimes the proud groom, had cemented itself as part of his lasting infamy. From Rome's marital circus, we shift to Bavaria, where a king's obsession with castles and fantasy drained his kingdom's coffers and ultimately cost him his crown. King Ludwig II of Bavaria bankrupted his country-building fairy tale castles and was deposed as insane. Ludwig II, often called the fairy tale king, ruled Bavaria from 1864 to 1886 and seemed more interested in architecture and myth than in politics. He was a romantic visionary, obsessed with medieval legends, operas by Richard Wagner, and the creation of castles so elaborate they seemed plucked from dreams. His most famous project, Neuschwanstein Castle, remains an icon of whimsical architecture, but in Ludwig's lifetime, it was a financial black hole. Ignoring state needs, Ludwig poured vast sums of the royal treasury into his building projects, commissioning not one but multiple palaces filled with gilded halls, mirrored chambers, and private theatres. His ministers begged him to slow down. Instead, he borrowed heavily, pushing Bavaria toward bankruptcy. Ludwig's retreat from public affairs only deepened concerns. He rarely appeared in Munich, preferring to live in isolation in his castles, surrounded by servants and indulging in elaborate fantasies. By 1886, government officials had had enough. They declared him mentally unfit to rule without a medical examination and placed him under arrest. Days later, Ludwig was found dead in shallow water alongside his psychiatrist. Officially, it was an accident or suicide, but suspicions of foul play have never vanished. Today, he's remembered as both a tragic dreamer and a cautionary tale about what happens when a monarch forgets that a kingdom's treasury is not a bottomless purse. From Ludwig's architectural excess, we turn to a Spanish king whose scandal wasn't about fantasy castles, but about an entirely different kind of private entertainment. King Alfonso XIII of Spain produced pornographic films for his own amusement. Alfonso XIII ruled Spain from 1886 to 1931, overseeing a turbulent era of political instability, colonial losses, and rising republican sentiment. But away from the public eye, the king had hobbies far removed from diplomacy and governance, one of the most scandalous being his alleged commissioning of pornographic films. According to accounts from the period, Alfonso used his personal fortune to finance a series of explicit short films in the early 20th century. These productions, known as cine pornografico, were not intended for public viewing, but for the private amusement of the king and his inner circle. The films were reportedly shot in Spain and France, often featuring risque scenarios with a comedic twist, a fusion of bawdy humour and royal voyeurism. For a conservative Catholic nation, the idea of the monarch as a silent film pornographer was explosive. While the allegations were not widely publicized during his reign, they became part of his tarnished legacy after his abdication in 1931. The loss of his throne, prompted by political failures and growing public resentment, only made the salacious rumors more enduring. Alfonso spent the rest of his life in exile, dying in Rome in 1941. His reign is often remembered for its political instability, but among the juicier footnotes is the image of a king quietly chuckling in a private theatre at films he had personally ordered into existence. And from a king funding X-rated cinema, we move to a French monarch whose scandal involved elevating his mistress to a level of influence that rivaled the Queen herself. King Henry II of France openly kept his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, as the real power in court. When Henry II ascended the French throne in 1547, he brought with him not just a Queen Catherine de' Medici, but also a mistress who would overshadow the royal marriage for decades. Diane de Poitiers was 20 years older than Henry, yet she wielded a kind of influence that left courtiers in awe and Catherine in a constant state of humiliation. Diane was no mere romantic companion. She was Henry's political confidant, financial advisor, and public partner in state events. The king showered her with titles, estates, and jewels, including the crown jewels themselves at one point. She appeared beside him at tournaments, received foreign envoys, and had a say in matters of governance. Catherine de' Medici, sidelined in her own marriage, bided her time. Her resentment only grew when Henry's affections never waned, even as the years passed. The court knew where the real power lay, and ambassadors often treated Diane as the de facto queen. When Henry died in 1559 from a jousting accident, Catherine moved swiftly to reclaim her position. She ordered Diane to return the crown jewels and stripped her of political influence, though she allowed her to live out her days in comfort. Still, for the duration of Henry's reign, Diane's dominance was one of the most open and most scandalous arrangements in European royal history. From Henry's court, where a mistress rivaled a queen, we move to another queen whose rumoured affair with a foreign duke ignited political tensions. Queen Anne of Austria's alleged affair with the Duke of Buckingham fueled political tension in France. Anne of Austria, queen consort to Louis XIII, was already in a politically precarious position. Born a Spanish princess, she was viewed with suspicion in France, especially during the frequent wars between her birth country and her adopted one. Into this tense atmosphere stepped George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, England's most glamorous and controversial courtier. In 1625, during diplomatic visits and political negotiations, Anne and Buckingham reportedly developed a deep, flirtatious bond. While concrete evidence of a full-blown affair is lacking, their meetings and Buckingham's open admiration set tongues wagging from Paris to London. The idea of a French queen consorting with an English duke, especially one involved in sensitive political matters, was explosive. Cardinal Richelieu, Louis XIII's powerful minister, seized on the rumours to tighten control over the queen, limiting her movements and correspondence. The alleged romance became a political weapon used to frame Anne as disloyal to France. The scandal even found its way into literature immortalized and embellished by Alexandre Dumas in The Three Musketeers. Whether a brief flirtation or a courtly friendship misread by observers, the Anne Buckingham connection added another layer of intrigue to a court already steeped in suspicion. From whispered flirtations, we move to a queen whose love affair didn't just cause scandal, it toppled a government. Queen Caroline Matilda of Denmark was caught in a passionate affair with the king's physician, Johann Friedrich Struensee, who effectively ruled Denmark until the scandal broke and both were arrested. Caroline Matilda, the English-born Queen of Denmark, was married to King Christian VII, a monarch plagued by mental instability and erratic behaviour. Their marriage was loveless, and the young queen found herself isolated in a foreign court. Enter Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's German physician. Struensee was more than a doctor, he was a reformer with Enlightenment ideals. As his influence over Christian grew, he began introducing sweeping political changes, from freedom of the press to the abolition of torture. All the while, he and Caroline Matilda embarked on a love affair that quickly became an open secret. For a brief period, Struensee effectively ruled Denmark through royal decrees, with Caroline Matilda as both his lover and ally. They were seen riding together, exchanging intimate notes, and most scandalously sharing private quarters during the king's absence. Court conservatives, already alarmed by Struensee's reforms, used the affair as the perfect weapon. In 1772, a coup ousted Struensee. He was arrested, tried, and executed for treason. Caroline Matilda was divorced, stripped of her royal title, and sent into exile in Germany, where she died just 3 years later, at age 23. Their downfall became one of the most infamous love scandals in royal history, a tale of passion, politics, and the dangerous intersection between the two. And from a queen's ruinous romance, We now turn to a Byzantine emperor whose mutilation and thirst for revenge became the stuff of legend. Emperor Justinian II of Byzantium had his nose cut off when overthrown, returned to power years later with a golden prosthetic, and took brutal revenge on his enemies. In the brutal politics of Byzantium, deposition was rarely a clean affair. When Justinian II was overthrown in 695, his enemies didn't just exile him, they mutilated him. Following a custom meant to ensure a ruler could never reclaim the throne, they slit his nose, believing the disfigurement would bar him from being seen as fit to rule. The emperor was then sent into exile in Cherson, far from Constantinople's golden domes. But Justinian II was nothing if not determined. He escaped, gathered support from foreign allies including the Bulgar Khan Tervel, and marched back to reclaim his empire in 705. To shock his enemies and announce his defiance, he wore a golden prosthetic nose. It was not just a practical solution, it was a statement. His enemies had failed to erase him. Once restored, Justinian's reign turned vengeful. He hunted down those who had betrayed him during his first rule. Former officials were executed, blinded, or tortured. His paranoia deepened, and his punishments grew so severe that he alienated even those who had once supported his return. By 711, rebellion flared again. Justinian was captured and beheaded. His severed head paraded through the streets. His dramatic life, marked by mutilation, comeback, and ruthless reprisals, cemented his place as one of the most memorable cautionary tales in Byzantine history. From Byzantine revenge, we turn to a modern empress whose fall from grace was fueled by whispers of lovers and political extravagance. Queen Soraya of Iran was divorced by the Shah because she couldn't produce an heir, but not before whispers of affairs and lavish spending swirled through Tehran's elite. Queen Soraya Esfandiari Bakhtiari entered the Iranian royal family in 1951 when she married Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. Glamorous, multilingual, and half German, she quickly became an icon of style in Tehran and beyond. But her marriage to the Shah faced one insurmountable problem. She could not bear children. For 7 years, the royal couple tried to produce an heir, the pressure mounting with each passing year. The Shah, desperate to secure the succession, faced growing political and familial pressure to divorce her. While infertility was the official reason, the royal court buzzed with other rumors about Soraya's supposed extravagance, private affairs, and her increasingly independent life away from her husband. In 1958, the Shah made the announcement, "My country needs a crown prince, and since I have been unable to obtain one from my queen, I am forced to dissolve my marriage." Soraya left Iran in heartbreak, moving to Europe where she reinvented herself as a socialite and occasional actress. The Iranian public, charmed by her beauty and poise, largely sympathized with her. Yet in elite circles, the gossip about her alleged affairs lingered, mingling with the tragedy of her forced departure from the royal stage. From Soraya's fall, we move to an emperor whose obsession with securing his daughter's succession nearly bankrupted an empire. Emperor Charles VI of the Holy Roman Empire nearly bankrupted his realm to ensure his daughter Maria Theresa inherited the throne, sparking a war across Europe. Charles VI faced a succession crisis. With no surviving sons, he wanted his daughter, Maria Theresa, to inherit the sprawling Habsburg lands. But there was a problem. The empire's laws traditionally favored male heirs. Determined to secure her claim, Charles issued the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713, a decree ensuring his daughter's right to rule. Getting Europe to recognize this decree was no small feat. Charles spent decades negotiating with rival powers, bribing potential challengers, and offering costly concessions. The financial strain on the empire was enormous. Treasury reserves dwindled, taxes rose, and discontent spread among his subjects. Despite the expense, Charles's strategy seemed to work, until he died in 1740. Almost immediately, rival claimants emerged, refusing to honor the pragmatic sanction. The result was the War of the Austrian Succession, a continent-wide conflict that pitted Maria Theresa against some of Europe's most formidable rulers. While Maria Theresa ultimately retained her throne, the war left the empire financially weakened and militarily strained. Charles VI's gamble spending fortunes to secure a promise that was broken almost instantly became one of the most expensive and ironic failures in dynastic history. From Charles's costly quest for succession, we move to an English king whose romantic life was as tangled as his political alliances. King George IV of England secretly married a Catholic widow, Maria Fitzherbert, in violation of royal law, while openly maintaining multiple mistresses. George IV's love life was a tangle of passion, rebellion, and scandal. Long before he became king, the Prince of Wales was already notorious for extravagance, gambling, and affairs. But his most explosive romantic decision came in 1785, when he secretly married Maria Fitzherbert, a twice-widowed Roman Catholic. The marriage was illegal under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which required the monarch's consent for any royal wedding. Worse still, English law forbade heirs to the throne from marrying Catholics altogether. The ceremony was private and unrecognized by the state, but, in the eyes of the couple and in the whispers of London society, it was real. While George's relationship with Maria endured in various on-again, off-again phases for decades, he still pursued other lovers with abandon. His official marriage to Princess Caroline of Brunswick in 1795 was a disaster from the start, each spouse detesting the other. George openly flaunted his mistresses, turning his personal life into public spectacle. When he finally ascended the throne in 1820, the Fitzherbert marriage was an open secret, but legally non-existent. The combination of bigamy, religious controversy, and flagrant infidelity made George one of Britain's most gossiped-about monarchs, a man whose personal indiscretions rivaled his political ones. From George's double life, we move to a Russian empress, whose dependence on a mystic fueled rumors that eroded an entire dynasty's credibility. Tsarina Alexandra of Russia's reliance on the mystic Rasputin during World War I fueled rumors of an affair and eroded the monarchy's credibility. As World War I ravaged the Russian Empire, Tsarina Alexandra found herself under immense pressure. Her husband, Tsar Nicholas II, was at the front commanding the army, leaving Alexandra to manage domestic affairs in a nation teetering on collapse. At the center of her political and personal world was one man, Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian peasant turned mystic with an uncanny ability to soothe the hemophilia attacks of her son, the heir to the throne. Alexandra's reliance on Rasputin was rooted in desperation. Her son's illness was a state secret, and Rasputin's apparent healing abilities seemed miraculous. But to the Russian elite and the public, the relationship looked suspicious. Whispers spread that the Tsarina and Rasputin were lovers, a claim amplified by his known debauchery and the scandals surrounding his behavior. Rasputin's growing influence over ministerial appointments and policy decisions further damaged the monarchy's credibility. Enemies of the Romanovs painted Alexandra as a German-born traitor controlled by a degenerate mystic, and these rumors spread like wildfire through Petrograd. By the time Rasputin was assassinated in 1916, the damage was irreversible. The monarchy's image had been so badly tarnished that, within months, it would fall to revolution. Alexandra's name became forever linked with Rasputin's, a partnership remembered more for its scandal than its truth. From the shadow of a mystic's influence, we turn to an English king whose suspicious death on a hunting trip sparked centuries of speculation. King William II of England's sudden death in a hunting accident led to centuries of speculation that his brother Henry had arranged it to seize the crown. In August 1100, King William II, known as William Rufus, rode into the New Forest for a hunting expedition. He never returned alive. Struck in the chest by an arrow, he fell dead almost instantly. Officially, the shot was an accident, fired by nobleman Walter Tyrrell, but the circumstances were suspicious from the very start. For one thing, William's younger brother, Henry, was in the hunting party. As soon as the king lay dead, Henry raced to seize the royal treasury at Winchester and then hurried to London, where he was crowned within days. The speed of his actions led many to wonder whether the accident had been an assassination in disguise. Adding to the intrigue, the New Forest had already gained a grim reputation. Two of William's relatives had previously died there under unusual circumstances. Chroniclers of the time recorded whispers that Tyrrell's shot had been deliberate, perhaps at Henry's behest. Henry, of course, denied any involvement. Whether the killing was plotted or truly a freak accident, it became one of the most enduring royal mysteries of the medieval period. And in the centuries since, the image of the arrow-struck king has stood as a reminder that in monarchy, the line between fate and foul play is often razor-thin. From the fatal woods of the New Forest, our next scandal takes us to Romania, where a queen's romantic entanglements blurred the lines of royal lineage. Queen Marie of Romania was rumoured to have had affairs with multiple political figures, some of whose children may have been fathered by lovers rather than her husband. Queen Marie of Romania, granddaughter of Queen Victoria and Tsar Alexander II, was one of the most glamorous royals of the early 20th century. Married to King Ferdinand I, she was admired for her beauty, charisma, and diplomatic skill, particularly during World War I, when she became a symbol of national unity. But beneath the glitter of her public image, rumours swirled about her private life. Court gossip and foreign envoys alike whispered that Marie's marriage was more political alliance than love match. She was linked romantically to several prominent men, including politicians, military officers, and aristocrats. Some of her children's paternity became subjects of speculation, with bold rumours claiming that at least two were fathered by her lovers rather than Ferdinand. Whether these claims were rooted in truth or political malice, they became part of Marie's legend. Her charm and tact ensured she avoided outright scandal during her lifetime, but the whispers persisted, especially as her children grew into major figures in European royal politics. Marie herself was never shy about cultivating close male friendships, blurring the lines between affection and romance in the eyes of her contemporaries. In later years, her memoirs danced around the subject with an artful blend of candour and discretion, leaving historians with tantalizing ambiguity. From Romania's Queen of Rumours, we travel back to medieval Spain, where a king's mistress provoked royal rage and bloody vengeance. King Alfonso VIII of Castile's dalliance with a mistress, Rahel la Formosa, enraged his queen so much that she allegedly arranged the mistress's murder. King Alfonso VIII of Castile ruled from 1158 to 1214, a long reign marked by both military victories and personal drama. His greatest scandal centered on his relationship with Rahel la Formosa, Rachel the Beautiful, a Jewish woman renowned for her beauty and wit. Alfonso's devotion to Rahel was intense and public enough to humiliate his wife, Queen Eleanor of England, daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine. The affair was a political powder keg. Not only did it challenge the Queen's dignity, but Rahel's Jewish heritage made the relationship controversial in a Christian kingdom already rife with religious tension. According to later chroniclers, Queen Eleanor's jealousy boiled over into deadly action. She is said to have orchestrated Rahel's murder, possibly by having her beaten or strangled. While the historical accuracy of this account is debated, the story persisted in Iberian legend for centuries, painting the queen as a woman who would defend her honor and her position at any cost. The affair and its violent end became part of the broader narrative of Alfonso's reign, a reminder that even the most formidable kings could find themselves undone by the politics of the bedchamber. From this royal love triangle, we leap to the Ottoman court, where a sultan's moral crackdown was undermined by his own hypocrisy. Sultan Murad of the Ottoman Empire banned alcohol, tobacco, and coffee, then was caught drinking himself. Sultan Murad IV ruled the Ottoman Empire from 1623 to 1640, a period of military revival and severe internal discipline. Known for his iron will, he famously banned alcohol, tobacco, and coffee, substances he believed were fueling moral decay and social unrest in Istanbul. The punishments for breaking these bans were harsh: public beatings, heavy fines, and even execution for repeat offenders. Murad personally enforced the laws, patrolling the streets in disguise to catch offenders. His reign became synonymous with strict moral order, and his reputation as a fearsome disciplinarian spread far beyond the capital. But behind palace walls, the story was different. Accounts from contemporaries claimed the Sultan himself indulged in wine, particularly in his later years. The hypocrisy was glaring. The man who executed subjects for drinking was said to enjoy the very vice he condemned. Whether exaggerated by his enemies or grounded in truth, the contradiction tarnished his moral authority. Murad's sudden death at the age of 27, possibly from alcohol-related illness, added a final ironic twist to his legacy. And from the streets of Istanbul, we now turn to England, where a king's excessive favoritism towards certain men would end in imprisonment and a bloody end. King Richard II of England was accused by enemies of favouring a male courtier, Robert de Vere, above all others, leading to political unrest. Richard II took the English throne in 1377 as a boy king, inheriting a realm still reeling from the Black Death and the 100 Years' War. As he grew into his role, his court became a magnet for young favourites, none more notorious than Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford. Their bond was so close and so openly displayed that it provoked suspicion and resentment among the nobility. De Vere's rapid rise in status was meteoric. Richard showered him with titles, estates, and influence, culminating in his elevation to Duke of Ireland, a title few in England thought he deserved. Chroniclers hinted that Richard's affection for de Vere went beyond friendship, though whether this was reality or political slander remains a matter of debate. The favoritism had tangible political consequences. Powerful lords, known as the Lords Appellant, saw de Vere as a threat to their own influence and as a symbol of the king's mismanagement. Their opposition erupted into open conflict during the 1387 crisis, culminating in de Vere's defeat at the Battle of Radcot Bridge and his flight into exile. Richard's continued loyalty to de Vere, even after his disgrace, cemented the perception of a king ruled by personal passions rather than political prudence, a reputation that would shadow him until his eventual deposition in 1399. From the suspicion of intimate favoritism, we turn to ancient Egypt, where a pharaoh's religious revolution upended the very foundations of his kingdom. Pharaoh Akhenaten abandoned Egypt's gods to worship Aten, possibly as a way to consolidate power under himself, causing religious chaos that his successors scrambled to erase. In the 14th century BCE, Akhenaten-born Amenhotep IV became pharaoh and launched one of the most radical religious shifts in history. Rejecting the traditional pantheon of Egyptian gods, he elevated Aten, the sun disk, to supreme deity. This was more than a theological choice. It was a political move that centralized religious authority in the person of the pharaoh himself, who styled himself as Aten's sole prophet. Akhenaten even abandoned the grand temples of Thebes for a brand new capital, Akhetaten, modern Amarna, built to glorify his chosen god. This abrupt transformation disrupted Egypt's priesthood, economy, and cultural traditions. Temples to other gods were closed, their treasures redirected to Aten's worship. The radical change was deeply unpopular, especially among the powerful priests of Amun, whose wealth and influence were dismantled. After Akhenaten's death, his successors, including the famous Tutankhamun, moved swiftly to restore the old religion. They defaced Akhenaten's monuments, erased his name from king lists, and buried his legacy in an official damnatio memoriae. Still, the heretic pharaoh left behind one of history's most fascinating royal scandals, a ruler willing to destroy centuries of tradition to elevate his own divine role, only to have it all undone within a generation. From a pharaoh who rewrote religion, we move to a Central European king whose death in battle sparked a crisis that tore apart the region. King Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia drowned while fleeing the Battle of Mohacs, sparking a succession crisis that tore apart Central Europe. On the 29th of August, 1526, the young King Louis II faced the Ottoman Empire at the Battle of Mohacs, a confrontation that would decide the fate of Hungary. At just 20 years old, Louis commanded an army ill-prepared to face the vastly superior forces of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. The battle was a disaster. Within hours, the Hungarian lines collapsed. Soldiers were slaughtered, nobles captured, and the battlefield became a scene of chaos. Louis, realizing the fight was lost, attempted to flee on horseback, but in the chaos of retreat, he and his horse stumbled into a marsh or river. Weighed down by armor, the king drowned before he could be rescued. His sudden death without an heir threw Hungary and Bohemia into a succession crisis. Multiple claimants emerged, including Ferdinand of Habsburg and John Zapolya, leading to decades of division and conflict. Much of Hungary eventually fell under Ottoman control, while the Habsburgs consolidated their hold on Bohemia. Louis's death was remembered not just as a personal tragedy, but as a turning point in Central European history, a moment when the fall of a young king opened the door to foreign domination and decades of political instability. From the muddy banks of Mohacs, we move to Spain, where a queen's religious zeal turned into one of the most infamous acts of forced conversion in history. Queen Isabella I of Castile's harsh expulsion of Jews and Muslims in 1492 enriched the crown, but also remains one of history's most infamous acts of forced conversion. In 1492, Queen Isabella I of Castile, alongside her husband Ferdinand II of Aragon, stood at the height of power. The Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian campaign to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula, had just culminated in the fall of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain. But military victory was quickly followed by a decision that would scar the kingdom's history: the expulsion of Spain's Jews, and soon after, Muslims who refused to convert. Through the Alhambra Decree, Isabella and Ferdinand ordered all practicing Jews to leave Spain within 4 months unless they converted to Christianity. The order uprooted hundreds of thousands, many of whom had lived in Iberia for generations. Those who stayed often did so under duress, becoming conversos or moriscos in name, but secretly maintaining their old faiths, a risk that made them targets for the newly empowered Spanish Inquisition. The policy served both ideological and financial goals. Confiscated property and abandoned businesses enriched the crown, while the move consolidated religious unity under Catholic rule. But the human cost was immense: families torn apart, communities scattered, and centuries of Jewish and Muslim contributions to Spanish culture systematically erased. Isabella's legacy remains sharply divided, revered in Catholic tradition, but remembered elsewhere as the architect of one of the largest forced migrations in European history. From religious purges in Spain, we turn to England, where a king's blatant favoritism toward his male companions ended with his imprisonment and murder. King Edward II of England's open favoritism toward Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, both suspected lovers, led to his imprisonment and eventual murder. Edward II's reign, 1327, was plagued by military failures, political instability, and personal scandals. Chief among them was his intense attachment to 2 men, first Piers Gaveston, then Hugh Despenser the younger. Gaveston, a charming Gascon knight, became Edward's constant companion, showered with titles and wealth far beyond his station. His arrogance and influence infuriated the nobility, who saw him as an interloper manipulating the king. When Gaveston was exiled, Edward repeatedly recalled him, defying Parliament and alienating his most powerful barons. In 1312, Gaveston was captured and executed by a group of nobles. But Edward's pattern of favoritism didn't end. He soon elevated Hugh Despenser, whose greed and cruelty quickly made him one of the most hated men in England. The tension boiled over into rebellion. Edward's own wife, Queen Isabella, allied with the rebels, invading England in 1326. Edward was captured and forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Edward III. Months later, Edward II died in captivity under mysterious and gruesome circumstances. Chroniclers spread the infamous tale that he was murdered with a red-hot poker, a detail likely invented to humiliate him posthumously. Whether true or not, the story cemented his reign as one of England's most scandalous, defined as much by personal attachments as political failures. From a king destroyed by his favorites, we shift to Russia, where a Tsar's iron-fisted suppression of dissent turned even his family into subjects of suspicion. Tsar Nicholas I of Russia crushed the Decembrist revolt with brutal executions, then used secret police to spy on everyone, including his own family. When Nicholas I ascended the Russian throne in 1825, it was in the shadow of the Decembrist revolt, a failed uprising by liberal army officers demanding constitutional reform. The revolt was swiftly crushed, but Nicholas's response set the tone for his reign: unyielding autocracy and surveillance. He ordered the execution of 5 Decembrist leaders and the exile of dozens more to Siberia. To ensure no such threat arose again, Nicholas expanded the powers of the Third Section, Russia's secret police, transforming it into a tool for rooting out dissent across the empire. The network of informants didn't spare the imperial family. Brothers, cousins, and even his own wife were quietly monitored for any hint of disloyalty. Writers, intellectuals, and students found themselves under constant watch, and censorship reached new extremes. Nicholas prided himself on maintaining orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality as the guiding principles of Russian life, but the cost was a climate of fear that stifled progress. By the time he died in 1855, he had preserved the empire's stability at the expense of leaving it brittle and resistant to change. From Nicholas's empire of suspicion, we turn to an English king whose conversion and absolutist ambitions led to a revolution that sent him into exile. King James II of England converted to Catholicism, secretly raised his son in the faith, and tried to push England toward absolutism, sparking the Glorious Revolution. James II, the throne in 1685, already carrying a heavy political liability, his open Catholicism in a predominantly Protestant nation. Though he had converted years earlier, his rise to power stirred deep fears that England might once again fall under papal influence. At first, his reign seemed stable, but James soon began making moves that alarmed Parliament and the public alike. He appointed Catholics to high offices, suspended laws against them, and clashed with the Anglican Church. His efforts to grant religious tolerance for Catholics and Protestant dissenters, though framed as progressive, were widely seen as a ploy to dismantle Protestant supremacy. The birth of his son, James Francis Edward, in 1688, intensified the crisis. Raised Catholic in secret, the boy represented the prospect of a Catholic dynasty. Opposition reached its breaking point when a group of nobles invited William of Orange, James's Protestant son-in-law, to invade. James fled to France without formally abdicating, a move his enemies painted as cowardice. This glorious revolution installed William and Mary on the throne and cemented constitutional monarchy in England, while James lived out his days in exile, still clinging to his claim. From a king exiled for his religion and ambition, we shift to China, where an emperor's quest for immortality may have hastened his own death. Emperor Ming of China's obsession with alchemy led to bizarre experiments with mercury, which may have hastened his death. The Jiajing Emperor of the Ming dynasty ruled from 1521 to 1567, a reign marked by political intrigue, superstition, and isolation from court life. Deeply interested in Taoist mysticism, he became fixated on alchemical practices promising immortality. Taoist alchemists offered elixirs said to extend life, many containing toxic ingredients like cinnabar, mercury sulfide, and other heavy metals. Convinced of their efficacy, the emperor consumed these concoctions regularly, despite occasional illness. He also engaged in bizarre rituals involving young women, believing their vitality could be absorbed into his own body through esoteric practices. His obsession with alchemy wasn't just a personal eccentricity, it affected governance. The emperor withdrew from active rule for long stretches, leaving court affairs in the hands of officials who often exploited the absence of oversight. Meanwhile, the imperial treasury funded his elaborate religious ceremonies and the construction of secluded palaces where his rituals could continue uninterrupted. By the time of his death, historians suspect years of mercury ingestion had poisoned him, contributing to chronic illness and ultimately his demise. Ironically, his pursuit of eternal life may have shortened it dramatically. From the deadly allure of immortality, we travel back to England, where a queen's rumoured infidelity threatened the legitimacy of the royal heir. Queen Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI of England, was rumoured to have borne a child fathered by her favourite, the Duke of Somerset. Queen Margaret of Anjou married Henry VI during the 100 Years' War, bringing with her a strong will and fierce political instincts, traits her gentle, pious husband sorely lacked. When Henry's bouts of mental illness left him incapacitated, Margaret effectively took the reins of government, drawing close to key allies. None was closer than Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. Their alliance became the subject of salacious gossip. In 1453, Margaret gave birth to Prince Edward of Westminster, and whispers spread that Somerset, not the king, was the true father. The rumour was politically potent. If true, it meant the heir to the throne was illegitimate. While there's no definitive evidence, the claim was weaponized by Yorkist rivals during the Wars of the Roses. It undermined Margaret's position and fueled propaganda portraying her as both an adulteress and a foreign usurper. Margaret fiercely defended her son's legitimacy, leading armies to protect his claim. Yet the prince's violent death at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471 and Margaret's subsequent captivity brought her political career to an end. The rumour of his paternity, however, lingered long after, a reminder of how a queen's reputation could be as decisive in war as any army. From Margaret's contested motherhood, we turn to the Holy Roman Emperor, whose private morals clashed spectacularly with his public role as Catholicism's champion. Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire fathered multiple illegitimate children while presenting himself as the defender of Catholic morality. Charles V, ruler of a vast empire that spanned from Spain to the Americas, positioned himself as the staunch defender of Catholicism during the Reformation. He fought Martin Luther's reforms, convened the Diet of Worms, and presented himself as the moral counterweight to Protestant heresy. Yet, behind the veneer of piety, his personal life was considerably less virtuous. The emperor fathered several illegitimate children with mistresses across Europe, most notably Margaret of Parma, whose mother was a Flemish servant. While illegitimate children among monarchs were not rare, Charles's public image as the embodiment of Catholic virtue made his private conduct especially ripe for criticism. His affairs were well known among the nobility, and foreign courts often whispered about the hypocrisy of a man who preached moral discipline while indulging his own passions freely. Despite the gossip, Charles acknowledged some of his illegitimate children and provided them with education and titles, integrating them into the political machinery of his empire. This practical approach ensured loyalty, but also underscored how his dynastic policies often blurred moral lines. From the duplicity of a pious emperor, we turn to a French king whose participation in religious slaughter forever stained his reign. King Charles IX of France personally participated in the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre, riding through Paris and shooting fleeing Protestants. The Street Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572 remains one of the most infamous episodes of religious violence in European history. While much of the planning is often attributed to Catherine de' Medici, her son, King Charles IX, was not just a passive figurehead, he reportedly took an active, bloody role. The massacre began in Paris after the wedding of the Protestant leader Henry of Navarre to the Catholic Princess Margaret of Valois, intended as a gesture of reconciliation. Instead, Huguenot leaders gathered for the wedding were targeted for assassination. The killings quickly spiraled into a citywide slaughter, spreading to other parts of France. Eyewitnesses and chroniclers claim that Charles IX, caught up in the fervour, mounted his horse and rode through the streets of Paris, firing an arquebus at Protestants attempting to flee. Whether out of conviction or madness, the image of the king hunting his own subjects cemented his reputation as a ruler complicit in sectarian murder. By the time the violence subsided, thousands were dead. Charles IX's health deteriorated rapidly in the years that followed, and some suggested he was haunted by guilt, though others saw it as divine judgment. From the streets of Paris drenched in blood, we move to an English queen whose fall was built on charges so sensational they still shock today. Queen Anne Boleyn's downfall came amid accusations of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, charges historians largely consider false. Anne Boleyn's rise to power was a story of ambition and romance, capturing the heart of Henry VIII, breaking England from Rome, and becoming queen in place of Catherine of Aragon. But her fall in 1536 was equally dramatic and far more sinister. After failing to produce a male heir and suffering a series of miscarriages, Anne found herself politically vulnerable. Henry's interest had shifted to Jane Seymour, and his advisors saw an opportunity to remove the Queen. Anne was arrested and charged with adultery, incest with her brother George Boleyn, and even conspiring to kill the king. The accusations were sensational and, to most modern historians, blatantly fabricated. Still, in the Tudor court, truth mattered less than political necessity. Several men were executed alongside her, all convicted on dubious evidence. On May 19, 1536, Anne was beheaded by a French swordsman in the Tower of London, delivering her final speech with composure and dignity. Her execution paved the way for Henry's third marriage, but it also turned her into one of history's most enduring figures, remembered both as a victim of courtly treachery and as a woman who had dared to play the game of power in a man's world. From Anne's orchestrated ruin, we turn to a Roman emperor whose campaign against a rising religion became one of history's most brutal persecutions. Emperor Diocletian launched the largest persecution of Christians in Roman history, burning scriptures and executing thousands. Diocletian, who ruled from 284 to 305 CE, is often credited with stabilizing the Roman Empire after a century of chaos. He restructured the government, fortified the borders, and reorganized the military. But for all his administrative skill, his reign is also remembered for its bloody crackdown on Christianity. In 303 CE, convinced that the growing Christian movement threatened Rome's unity in traditional gods, Diocletian issued a series of edicts aimed at eradicating the faith. Christian churches were demolished, scriptures burned, and clergy imprisoned. Those who refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods faced execution, often by public torture or arena spectacles. This great persecution spread across the empire, varying in intensity depending on local governors, but in some regions it reached near genocidal fervor. Entire communities were uprooted, and thousands of Christians were martyred. Ironically, instead of destroying Christianity, the brutality strengthened it. The faith's martyrs became powerful symbols, and within a decade of Diocletian's abdication, Constantine would legalize Christianity, setting it on the path to becoming the empire's dominant religion. From the blood-soaked arenas of Rome, we move to France, where a king's war against a powerful order of knights was driven by greed as much as piety. King Philip IV of France arrested and tortured the Knights Templar, seizing their wealth to fill his treasury. Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, was not a man to let morals get in the way of financial necessity. By the early 1302, his wars and lavish court had left France deeply in debt, much of it owed to the wealthy and powerful Knights Templar. Rather than repay them, Philip set about destroying them. On Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, he ordered the arrest of the Templars across France, accusing them of heresy, idolatry, and moral depravity. Under torture, many confessed to fabricated crimes, giving Philip the justification he needed to seize their assets. The trial dragged on for years, culminating in the dissolution of the Templar Order by Pope Clement V himself under Philip's influence. In 1314, the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake, famously cursing the king and the Pope as he died. Philip got his treasure, but not for long. Within the year, both he and Clement were dead, feeding centuries of legends about the Templars' curse. From Philip's politically convenient purge, we shift to Madagascar, where a queen ruled with iron will, ruthless punishments, and a personal life as scandalous as her politics. Queen Ranavalona, Eye of Madagascar, ruled with an iron fist, executing or enslaving tens of thousands, while also taking numerous lovers from her court. Ranavalona, Eye came to power in 1828 and reigned for more than 3 decades, transforming Madagascar into a fiercely independent but brutally governed kingdom. She resisted European colonial influence, keeping foreign missionaries and merchants at bay, but her domestic rule was marked by fear and bloodshed. Ranavalona employed forced labor on a massive scale, conscripting her subjects for endless construction projects and military campaigns. Those accused of disloyalty faced execution, exile, or the dreaded Tangina ordeal trial by poison, which claimed thousands of lives. Her personal life was no less controversial. The queen openly took lovers from among her officers and courtiers, sometimes elevating them to positions of power and other times discarding them with lethal consequences. These relationships, combined with her absolute authority, blurred the lines between personal desire and political maneuvering. Despite, or perhaps because of, her ruthlessness, Ranavalona maintained Madagascar's sovereignty during a period when much of Africa was falling under European control. By the time of her death in 1861, she had earned a reputation as both a national defender and one of history's most tyrannical monarchs. From the highlands of Madagascar, our next scandal takes us to Scandinavia, where a king turned a diplomatic banquet into a massacre that would be remembered for centuries. King Christian II of Denmark ordered the massacre of Swedish nobles during a banquet, an event known as the Stockholm Bloodbath. In November 1520, King Christian II of Denmark and Norway, freshly crowned as King of Sweden, invited the Swedish nobility to a lavish coronation banquet in Stockholm. The mood was celebratory. After years of conflict in the Kalmar Union, it seemed reconciliation might finally be at hand. But beneath the feasting and music, Christian had a much darker plan. Over 3 days, the festivities flowed with wine, speeches, and formal pledges of loyalty. Then, on the final day, the king accused his Swedish hosts of heresy charges stemming from their resistance to his rule. Under the guise of religious justice, he ordered their arrest. The next morning, the executions began. Bishops, nobles, and leading citizens, around 80 to 100 people, were beheaded in the city square. Blood ran through the cobblestones as onlookers realized the coronation feast had been a trap. The bodies were later burned, their ashes scattered, denying them proper burial. The massacre destroyed any goodwill Christian might have gained from his coronation. It sparked renewed rebellion, and within 3 years, Sweden had broken free under King Gustav Vasa. Christian II's ruthlessness earned him the nickname Christian the Tyrant, a legacy that overshadowed his later attempts at reform. From a banquet turned bloodbath, we travel to India, where an emperor's harem became a tool of political domination. Emperor Akbar of the Mughal Empire maintained a harem of hundreds of wives and concubines, using marriage alliances to consolidate political power. Akbar the Great, who ruled from 1556 to 1605, is often celebrated for his administrative genius, religious tolerance, and military expansion. But his harem was more than a private indulgence, it was a calculated instrument of statecraft. The Mughal harem housed hundreds of women, including wives, concubines, and attendants. Many of these marriages were political alliances, binding regional rulers and rival kingdoms to the emperor through kinship. A Rajput princess, for example, might marry Akbar in exchange for her father's loyalty and military support. Life inside the harem was luxurious, yet strictly regulated. The women were guarded by eunuchs and lived in opulent quarters, with their own hierarchy and influence. Some wielded significant political sway, acting as intermediaries between their families and the emperor. Akbar's use of the harem as a diplomatic tool strengthened his empire, but it also fed stories of his insatiable appetite for women. Though many of his unions were strategic, the sheer scale of his household became a point of fascination and moral judgment for contemporary observers. From the marble walls of Akbar's palace, we move to Scotland, where a king's numerous illegitimate children earned him a reputation for reckless romance. King James V of Scotland left at least a dozen illegitimate children scattered across the country. James V of Scotland, who reigned from 1513 until his death in 1542, was both a shrewd political operator and an unapologetic womanizer. Throughout his life, he fathered numerous illegitimate children, at least a dozen by known mistresses, and likely more whose identities never made the records. Many of these children were acknowledged and given positions of influence. Some became bishops or abbots, while others married into the Scottish nobility, further intertwining the king's personal liaisons with political strategy. By recognizing his bastards and placing them advantageously, James reinforced his network of loyalty across the kingdom. His amorous exploits became part of his public persona. Chroniclers and balladeers alternately praised his virility and criticized his lack of restraint. The royal court was abuzz with tales of the king's late-night adventures and romantic entanglements, which sometimes stirred resentment among the nobility. Despite his personal excesses, James V left a legitimate heir, Mary, Queen of Scots. But his tendency to favour certain illegitimate children and mistresses over established courtiers created friction that outlived him. His legacy, in part, is that of a king whose dynastic web extended far beyond the bounds of lawful marriage. From a Scottish king's scattered progeny, we next cross to England, where a queen's burning zeal for religious uniformity earned her a grim nickname that has echoed through history. Queen Mary I of England, Bloody Mary, earned her nickname by burning hundreds of Protestants at the stake to restore Catholicism. Mary, I ascended the English throne in 1553, determined to undo the Protestant reforms of her father, Henry VIII, and her half-brother, Edward VI. A devout Catholic, she saw the re-establishment of papal authority as both a personal mission and a divine duty. But her campaign for religious restoration came with fire, literally. Within months of her coronation, Parliament repealed Protestant laws, and heresy trials began. Those who refused to recant their Protestant beliefs were condemned to death by burning. The most prominent victims included bishops Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Thomas Cranmer, whose executions became rallying cries for Protestant resistance. Between 1555 and 1558, around 280 people were burned alive, from well-known preachers to ordinary citizens. The flames lit in towns across England seared Mary's reputation into history. While she believed she was saving souls, the brutality of her methods horrified many contemporaries and later chroniclers, including John Foxey, whose Book of Martyrs cemented the nickname Bloody Mary. Her reign ended in 1558 with her death from illness, childless, and with England more firmly Protestant than before. Her attempt to reverse the Reformation instead became a cautionary tale about the dangers of ruling through religious terror. From the pyres of England, we turn to Sweden, where a king's relentless military obsession drained his kingdom of both wealth and peace. King Charles XII of Sweden left his country bankrupt and war-torn after his obsession with military campaigns. Charles XII became king in 1697, at just 15 years old, and almost immediately his reign became defined by war. Initially hailed as a military prodigy for his early victories in the Great Northern War, Charles seemed unstoppable, but his appetite for battle proved insatiable and disastrous. Rather than consolidate his gains, Charles pursued campaigns deep into enemy territory, taking Sweden's armies far from home for years on end. His most notorious blunder came in 1709 when he invaded Russia. The campaign ended in catastrophe at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, shattering Sweden's dominance in the region. Even after this crushing defeat, Charles refused to make peace. He spent years in exile in the Ottoman Empire, then returned to drag his war-weary nation into further conflicts. By the time of his death in 1718 killed during a siege in Norway, Sweden was bankrupt, its manpower depleted, and its empire reduced. Charles's single-minded militarism left a legacy of both admiration and ruin. Admired for his courage, condemned for his inability to temper ambition with pragmatism. From a king lost in battle lust, we turn to China's Han Dynasty, where an emperor's paranoia led him to destroy his own family. Emperor Wu of Han executed his own wife and crown prince after accusations of witchcraft. Emperor Wu, one of the most celebrated rulers of China's Han Dynasty, is remembered for expanding the empire's territory, centralizing its administration, and fostering cultural achievements. But his reign also had a darker side, marked by deep suspicion and a willingness to kill even those closest to him. In his later years, court intrigues swirled with accusations of witchcraft, a crime that in ancient China could carry the death penalty. In 91 BCE, charges were brought against Empress Wei and Crown Prince Lu Ju, alleging they had engaged in sorcery to curse the emperor. Historians believe these accusations were politically motivated, possibly orchestrated by rivals seeking to eliminate the heir. The emperor, already aging and distrustful, accepted the claims. A brutal purge followed, with hundreds executed. The crown prince, cornered by imperial forces, took his own life. Empress Wei was compelled to commit suicide. Only after their deaths did Emperor Wu reportedly realize the truth that the accusations had been false. Racked with regret, he built memorials to them, but the damage was irreversible. From the bloody fallout of palace conspiracies, we now turn to France, where a king's mastery of intrigue earned him a spider's web of power and enemies. King Louis XI of France used espionage, blackmail, and assassination to eliminate rivals, earning the nickname the Universal Spider. Louis XI, who reigned from 1461 to 1483, was not the sort of king who relied on battlefield glory or chivalric ideals to expand his power. Instead, he wove a network of spies, informants, and covert agents so intricate that it earned him the ominous moniker, the Universal Spider. His enemies often didn't see his hand until they were already tangled in his web. Rather than confront rivals openly, Louis preferred quiet manipulation. He used bribery to turn enemies into informants, blackmail to silence dissent, and assassination when subtlety failed. Nobles who threatened his authority sometimes found themselves implicated in fabricated plots or simply disappeared. Louis's reach extended beyond France's borders. His agents infiltrated foreign courts, sowing misinformation to destabilize adversaries. He also exploited the printing press to spread propaganda, an innovation in political warfare at the time. His methods, while effective, earned him a reputation for duplicity and cold-blooded calculation. Yet they also strengthened the French crown, centralizing power and weakening the feudal nobility. Louis XI proved that a king could rule as much through secrecy as through swords, a lesson future monarchs would heed. From the shadows of French intrigue, we move to Spain, where a queen's love affairs shaped royal policy and fueled scandal. Queen Maria Luisa of Spain was accused of taking lovers openly and influencing her husband's political decisions for personal gain. Maria Luisa of Parma, Queen Consort to King Charles IV of Spain, was one of the most talked about women in late 18th century Europe, and not for her diplomacy or charity. Court gossip accused her of taking lovers openly, most notoriously Manuel Godoy, a handsome young guard who rose with astonishing speed to become Spain's prime minister. Whether or not the affair was physical, Maria Luisa's influence over Godoy was undeniable. He received unprecedented power and privileges, prompting whispers that he was not only the Queen's favourite, but also the King's puppet. Political opponents claimed that state policy was shaped as much in the Queen's bedchamber as in the Royal Council. Her lavish spending and perceived disregard for decorum further alienated her from the Spanish public, especially as the country's fortunes declined in the face of Napoleonic pressures. Satirical pamphlets painted her as a scheming adulteress whose personal desires outweighed the welfare of the nation. Though many accusations were likely exaggerated, Maria Luisa's reputation never recovered. By the time she and Charles IV abdicated in 1808, she was widely reviled, a symbol of royal corruption and excess. From the salons of Madrid, we travel to the battlefields of Bulgaria, where an emperor's vengeance became a legend of medieval cruelty. Emperor Basil the Bulgar Slayer blinded 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners, leaving one-eyed men to guide each 100 home. In 1014, during the Byzantine-Bulgarian Wars, Emperor Basil II crushed the forces of Bulgarian Tsar Samuel at the Battle of Kleidion. The victory was decisive, but it was what Basil did afterward that secured his infamous place in history. The emperor ordered the capture of approximately 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers. Rather than kill them outright, he commanded that nearly all be blinded, leaving one man in each group of 100 with one eye intact to guide the others home. The grim procession of mutilated men staggering back to Bulgaria was as much psychological warfare as punishment. According to chroniclers, the sight so shocked Tsar Samuel that he collapsed from a heart attack and died 2 days later. This act earned Basil his fearsome epithet, the Bulgar Slayer, and cemented his reputation as both a brilliant strategist and a ruler capable of ruthless cruelty. His calculated brutality served as a warning to other foes. Defeat at his hands could mean a fate worse than death. From the blinding fields of Kleidion, we turn to England, where a king's greed and lust for power drove him to prey on his own nobility. King John of England extorted money through illegal taxes, kidnapped noblewomen, and was accused of trying to seduce his own niece. King John, who reigned from 1199 to 1216, is remembered as one of England's most unpopular monarchs, and not just because of losing vast French territories or being forced to sign the Magna Carta. His personal conduct was as notorious as his political failures. John was infamous for squeezing money from his barons through arbitrary fines and illegal taxes. These weren't just fiscal measures, they were often personal punishments against nobles who defied him. But the king's greed wasn't confined to gold. Chroniclers claimed he also preyed on the wives and daughters of his barons, forcing them into his bed under threat of imprisonment or worse. One of the most scandalous accusations was that John attempted to seduce or possibly assault his own niece, Isabella of Angoulême, before marrying her. This behavior, whether exaggerated or true, fed the narrative of a king whose appetites had no moral boundaries. His abuses of both power and people eroded loyalty among the nobility, leading to the rebellion that culminated in the Magna Carta. Even after his death, John's reputation remained blackened, a king whose personal vices were as damaging as his political blunders. From a king who preyed on his own nobles, we shift to Egypt, where a harem conspiracy brought down one of the last great pharaohs. Pharaoh Ramses III was assassinated in a harem conspiracy led by one of his wives, who wanted her son to inherit the throne. Ramses III, often called the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, reigned from 1186 to 1155 BCE. His rule was marked by military victories and monumental building projects, but also by palace intrigue of the deadliest kind. One of his secondary wives, Tie, conspired to place her own son, Pentawere, on the throne instead of the designated heir. She rallied disaffected courtiers, servants, and even members of the harem to her cause. The plot, known today as the harem conspiracy, culminated in an attempt on the pharaoh's life. For centuries, the outcome was uncertain. Records hinted that Ramses died suddenly, but no cause was given. Modern forensic studies of his mummy revealed his throat had been cut, confirming assassination. The conspirators were tried and executed, with Pentawere forced to commit suicide. The affair not only ended Ramses III's life, but also weakened Egypt's already declining power, hastening the end of its imperial age. From the bloodied halls of Egypt's royal harem, we move to post-Napoleonic France, where rumors of royal decadence once again filled the air. King Louis XVIII of France returned to power after Napoleon, but his court was plagued with rumors of orgies and bribery. When Louis XVIII reclaimed the French throne in 1814, he presented himself as the dignified restorer of Bourbon legitimacy. But within the gilded salons of the Tuileries Palace, whispers painted a very different picture. Courtiers and foreign diplomats gossiped about lavish parties that devolved into debauchery, with accusations of discreet orgies involving both nobles and entertainers. Whether these tales were exaggerated or politically motivated, they stuck, reinforcing the image of a monarchy out of touch with the people. Bribery scandals further tarnished his reign. Access to royal favor, lucrative offices, and government contracts often seemed to depend more on private payments than merit. Critics charged that the king's ministers treated state policy as a marketplace for personal enrichment. Although Louis maintained political stability after years of upheaval, the aura of moral corruption surrounding his court weakened public confidence in the Bourbon Restoration. His reign became a symbol of how quickly royal dignity could be undermined by whispers of vice. From the rumor-filled salons of Paris, we head east to China, where an emperor stepped down from the throne but never truly let go of power. Emperor Qianlong of China abdicated to honor his grandfather's reign length but still ruled from behind the scenes in luxury. The Qianlong Emperor, one of the Qing dynasty's longest reigning monarchs, was a ruler obsessed with legacy. His grandfather, the Kangxi Emperor, had ruled for 61 years, a record Qianlong refused to surpass out of filial respect. In 1796, after exactly 60 years on the throne, he ceremoniously abdicated in favor of his son, Emperor Jiaqing. It was a grand gesture on paper. In reality, Qianlong retained full control over the empire. From his luxurious retirement palaces, he continued to direct policy, appoint officials, and preside over court affairs, leaving his nominal successor with little real power. During this retirement, Qianlong indulged his love of art, poetry, and elaborate building projects. He amassed vast collections of paintings, jade, and calligraphy, while commissioning ornate gardens and pavilions. His lavish spending strained the imperial treasury, especially as corruption flourished under his trusted favorite, He Shen, a man widely reviled for exploiting his position to amass staggering personal wealth. By the time Qianlong truly relinquished control, the once strong Qing dynasty was showing signs of decline, weighed down by internal rot that his hands-off yet controlling rule had allowed to fester. From a Chinese emperor clinging to power, we moved to Norway, where a king's indecision over succession left his kingdom in chaos. King Håkon VI of Norway left his kingdom in chaos by refusing to name a clear heir until his death. Håkon VI, who ruled Norway in the late 14th century, faced a succession question that could have shaped the stability of the realm. Yet instead of making a definitive choice during his lifetime, he allowed the issue to fester a decision that would plunge Norway into uncertainty after his death. Married to Margaret, daughter of King Valdemar IV of Denmark, Håkon had one son, Olav. The boy's claim was strong, but political complications with Denmark and Sweden made the succession delicate. Instead of securing Olav's position through formal arrangements, Håkon hesitated, leaving the court divided and rival factions ready to press their own candidates. When Håkon died in 1380, Olav inherited both the Norwegian and Danish thrones, but at just 10 years old, he required a regent, his mother Margaret. While she proved an astute ruler, the lack of clear planning from Håkon's reign meant Norway's political alliances and internal unity were fragile, setting the stage for the eventual formation of the Kalmar Union. From a hesitant Norwegian king, we travel to Rome, where an emperor murdered his own brother in a shocking display of fratricidal ambition. Emperor Caracalla murdered his own brother in their mother's arms to secure sole control of Rome. The Roman Empire in the early 3rd century was ruled jointly by two brothers, Caracalla and Geta, sons of Emperor Septimius Severus. The arrangement was supposed to ensure stability, but the siblings despised each other, and their rivalry poisoned the court. In 211 CE, after their father's death, the tension reached its breaking point. According to ancient sources, the brothers divided the imperial palace between them and avoided meeting in person. Their mother, Julia Domna, attempted to mediate, arranging a peace meeting in her private chambers. It was there that Caracalla struck. Surrounded by armed guards, he attacked Geta during the meeting, killing him as Julia Domna desperately tried to shield her younger son. Geta reportedly died in his mother's arms, his blood staining her clothing. Caracalla then launched a purge, executing thousands of Geta's supporters and ordering his brother's name erased from monuments, a campaign of damnatio memoriae. The murder not only secured Caracalla's sole rule but also cemented his legacy as one of Rome's most ruthless emperors. From the blood-soaked marble floors of Rome, we sail to England, where a queen turned piracy into royal policy. Queen Elizabeth. I encouraged and rewarded pirates, including Sir Francis Drake, for plundering Spanish ships. Elizabeth I's reign is often remembered for its cultural flowering and military triumphs, but it also had a distinctly piratical streak. The Queen maintained an uneasy peace with Catholic Spain for much of her early rule, Yet she covertly sanctioned English privateers pirates with royal permission to raid Spanish treasure fleets returning from the Americas. Figures like Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Hawkins became national heroes, but their exploits were often indistinguishable from outright piracy. They attacked Spanish ports, looted gold and silver, and sometimes seized entire cargoes of exotic goods. Elizabeth's cut of the spoils helped fill England's treasury without the costs of open war. Drake's most famous act came in 1580, when he returned from circumnavigating the globe laden with Spanish plunder. Elizabeth personally knighted him aboard his ship, the Golden Hind, sending a clear message to Spain that England celebrated rather than punished such raids. This shadow war escalated tensions that would eventually lead to the Spanish Armada in 1588. By then, Elizabeth's sea dogs had already inflicted serious economic damage on Spain, proving that piracy could serve as effective foreign policy. From the salty decks of Elizabethan privateers, we turn to a king whose own romantic entanglements were far less glamorous and far more scandalous. King George III secretly married a woman of lower rank before his official marriage, a fact covered up for decades. George III is remembered for losing the American colonies and for his later descent into mental illness, but one of his earliest scandals was a royal marriage that technically should have disqualified him from the throne. As a young man, George allegedly wed Hannah Lightfoot, a Quaker merchant's daughter, in a secret ceremony. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which would later require the monarch's consent for all royal weddings, wasn't yet in place, but marriage to a commoner, especially outside the Anglican faith, was socially unacceptable and politically dangerous. The alleged union was quietly swept under the rug, and Hannah disappeared from public life. Years later, George married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz in a grand public ceremony, producing a large royal family. But whispers about his earlier marriage persisted, surfacing in court cases and political pamphlets. While historians still debate whether the marriage truly occurred, the persistence of the rumor reveals just how damaging such a breach of royal protocol could be, especially for a king who cultivated an image of moral uprightness. From a hidden marriage in England, we head to Imperial China, where a usurper emperor erased history to justify his bloody rise. Emperor Yongle of China seized the throne from his nephew in a bloody coup and burned historical records to legitimize himself. The Yongle Emperor, one of the most influential rulers of the Ming dynasty, did not come to power through peaceful succession. In 1399, he launched the Jingnan campaign against his young nephew, the Jianwen Emperor, under the pretense of rectifying court politics. The war raged for 3 years, devastating large swaths of China. In 1402, Yongle's forces captured the capital, Nanjing. The Jianwen Emperor vanished in the chaos. Some accounts claim he perished in a palace fire, others that he escaped in disguise. Yongle wasted no time declaring himself emperor. To secure his legitimacy, Yongle ordered the destruction or alteration of official records from his nephew's reign, ensuring future generations would know little of the man he had overthrown. He also embarked on ambitious projects to strengthen his rule, moving the capital to Beijing, commissioning the massive Yongle Encyclopedia, and sponsoring the treasure voyages of Admiral Zheng He. Yet his reign remained shadowed by the violence of his ascent. The careful erasure of history could not fully conceal the fact that the Ming throne had been won through civil war and the likely murder of family. From the smoke-filled halls of a usurped palace, we next move to Spain, where a king's obsessive micromanagement proved disastrously short-sighted. King Philip II of Spain micromanaged his empire so obsessively that he ignored urgent crises, like the disaster of the Spanish Armada. Philip II ruled over one of the largest empires in history, stretching from the Americas to the Philippines. Yet, instead of delegating power across his far-flung territories, he insisted on reviewing even the smallest matters personally. Couriers carried endless piles of documents to his desk in the Escorial Palace, where Philip would spend hours in solitary study, annotating and approving minutiae that most monarchs would leave to ministers. This obsession with detail might have worked for a smaller realm, but for a global empire, it meant delays, bottlenecks, and missed opportunities. When critical crises arose, Philip's slow, centralized decision-making often left Spain vulnerable. The most notorious example was the Spanish Armada of 1588. Philip meticulously planned the invasion of England down to the last ship's provisions, yet failed to adapt when bad weather and logistical errors doomed the mission. Even as disaster unfolded, he hesitated to adjust the strategy, trusting divine providence over practical intervention. While Philip's micromanagement allowed him to maintain tight control over court politics, it also hampered Spain's ability to respond to dynamic threats. His reign left the empire still vast, but showing cracks that would widen in the decades to come. From the cramped chambers of the Escorial, we turn to Victorian Britain, where a royal scandal would be linked, however falsely, to one of history's most infamous murder sprees. Queen Victoria's son, Prince Albert Victor, was implicated, likely falsely, in the Jack the Ripper murders due to his scandalous reputation. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, was the eldest son of Edward VII, and second in line to the throne. Charming but widely regarded as intellectually limited, he nonetheless made frequent appearances in the gossip columns of late 19th century Britain. His name became permanently linked to scandal when rumours surfaced of his alleged visits to homosexual brothels, a serious offence in Victorian society. These whispers, combined with his social circle's connections to London's East End, later fed a sensational conspiracy theory that the Duke himself was Jack the Ripper. The theory, first popularised decades after the Whitechapel murders of 1888, claimed Albert Victor either committed the killings or was involved in covering them up. Historians have thoroughly debunked this, pointing out he wasn't even in London during some of the murders. Still, the rumour stuck, reflecting how his reputation for impropriety made him a convenient scapegoat. Albert Victor died young in 1892 from influenza, leaving the throne to his younger brother, the future George V, but his name remained tied to one of the most infamous crime sprees in history. From Victorian gossip, we cross to the final days of Byzantium, where an emperor's rumoured love affairs became a sideshow to a collapsing empire. Emperor Constantine XI of Byzantium was rumoured to have taken lovers from both sexes while defending his crumbling empire. Constantine XI, Palaiologos, the last emperor of the Byzantine Empire, inherited a realm reduced to little more than the city of Constantinople and a few outlying territories. Facing the might of the Ottoman Empire under Mehmed II, his final years were dominated by preparations for the inevitable siege. Yet even as he fortified the city's walls and sought foreign aid, court gossip swirled about his private life. Rumours claimed the emperor took lovers from both sexes, a scandalous accusation in the conservative Orthodox society of the 15th century. Whether true or not, such talk reflected both the desperation and moral anxiety of a court awaiting its doom. Constantine's sexuality, however, was irrelevant when the Ottomans launched their final assault in May 1453. He fought bravely in the streets, refusing to flee, and was last seen casting aside his imperial regalia to fight as an ordinary soldier. His body was never definitively identified. The rumours faded in the face of his martyr-like end, but they remain a reminder that even in the last days of a 1,000-year empire, court intrigue still found room to question the ruler's private passions. From Constantinople's final stand, we move to Poland, where a king's scandalous marriage ignited national outrage. King Sigismund II, Augustus of Poland, married his mistress, Barbara Radziwiłł, against fierce opposition, sparking a national scandal. Sigismund II, Augustus, the last male monarch of the Jagiellonian dynasty, was a king who let love override political caution. His mistress, Barbara Radziwiłł, came from one of the most powerful noble families in Lithuania, but her reputation for promiscuity made her an unsuitable match in the eyes of Poland's conservative nobility. Despite fierce resistance from the Sejm Polish parliament and his own mother, Queen Bona Sforza, Sigismund married Barbara in secret around 1547. When the marriage became public, the uproar was immediate. Nobles feared the Radziwiłł family would gain disproportionate influence over the crown, while Queen Bona allegedly attempted to annul the union by spreading rumours about Barbara's morals. Sigismund, defiant, insisted on having Barbara crowned queen consort in 1550, yet their marriage was short-lived. Barbara died later that year, possibly of illness, though whispers of poison at the Queen Mother's behest have persisted for centuries. The scandal left deep scars in the Polish court, straining relations between the monarch and the nobility. Sigismund never remarried for love, and Barbara's ghost, both literal in folklore and figurative in political memory, haunted his reign. From a doomed royal romance, we turn to Spain, where inbreeding produced a king so frail he could barely rule at all. Emperor Charles II of Spain, physically and mentally disabled from inbreeding, was paraded as a ruler while others controlled the throne. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg monarch of his line, was born in 1661, already burdened by generations of intermarriage among European royals. His family tree was so entangled that his parents were uncle and niece, a genetic legacy that left Charles with severe physical deformities, developmental delays, and chronic illness. Nicknamed El Hechizado, the Bewitched, Charles was believed by some contemporaries to be cursed. In truth, his disabilities made it impossible for him to govern effectively. Regents, ministers, and foreign advisors wielded real power, using the king as a ceremonial figurehead while maneuvering for their own advantage. Despite multiple marriages, Charles produced no heir. His death in 1700 triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that redrew the map of Europe. His reign is often remembered as a tragic example of how dynastic inbreeding can undermine not only a royal bloodline, but also an entire empire's stability. From a powerless king in Madrid, we head to England, where a secret marriage set off decades of dynastic chaos. King Edward IV of England secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, angering his court and sparking decades of dynastic strife. Edward IV, a tall and charismatic warrior king of the Wars of the Roses, stunned his court in 1464 when he revealed he had married Elizabeth Woodville in secret. Elizabeth was a commoner and a widow of a Lancastrian knight, hardly the politically advantageous bride expected for the Yorkist king. The marriage enraged Edward's closest ally, Richard Neville, the powerful Earl of Warwick, who had been negotiating a match with a French princess. Feeling betrayed, Warwick turned against Edward, sparking renewed conflict in the already bloody dynastic struggle between York and Lancaster. Elizabeth's large family was elevated to positions of influence, further alienating old Yorkist supporters. Over the years, Her kin became entangled in court intrigues, rivalries, and revenge killings, deepening factional divides. Edward's choice, born of personal desire rather than political strategy, had long-term consequences. The instability it helped create fed directly into the turmoil that followed his death, including the rise of Richard III and the eventual victory of the Tudors at Bosworth. From a love match that shook a kingdom, we sail to France, where an emperor's appetites were as persistent in old age as they were in youth. Emperor Napoleon III of France kept a string of mistresses and was caught visiting brothels even in old age. Napoleon III, nephew of the legendary Napoleon Bonaparte, presented himself as a modern, sophisticated ruler when he became Emperor of the French in 1852. But his carefully cultivated public image was constantly undermined by his private indulgences. He was a notorious womanizer, maintaining a steady rotation of mistresses throughout his reign. Among his most famous lovers was the actress Marguerite Belanger, whose ostentatious displays of jewelry and wealth became a symbol of the emperor's infidelity. His affairs were hardly discreet. The press and political satirists lampooned his escapades, often pairing them with critiques of his foreign policy blunders. Even in his later years, after losing the Franco-Prussian War and going into exile in England, Napoleon III's reputation for sexual adventure persisted. Reports circulated of his visits to brothels despite deteriorating health, a habit that struck many as both pathetic and oddly consistent with the rest of his life. Though he is remembered for reshaping Paris and attempting to modernize France, his personal scandals eroded his dignity and left a lasting impression of a ruler unable to separate passion from politics. From the boudoirs of Paris, we turn to Versailles, where a king's most personal humiliation became public gossip across Europe. King Louis XVI of France was humiliated when pamphlets mocked his alleged impotence during the early years of his marriage to Marie Antoinette. Louis XVI's marriage to the Austrian Archduchess Marie Antoinette was intended to cement the Franco-Austrian alliance, but for years the union failed to produce an heir. Court gossip quickly turned to speculation about the king's virility, with rumours claiming he was impotent or physically incapable of consummating the marriage. Pamphlets mocking the royal couple circulated widely, portraying Louis as weak and unmanly, while painting Marie Antoinette as either sexually frustrated or seeking satisfaction elsewhere. In reality, the issue may have been a medical condition, possibly phimosis, that made intercourse painful. Once treated, the couple finally had children, but the damage to their public image was irreversible. The whispers of bedroom failure fed into broader criticisms of the monarchy, contributing to the caricature of Louis as indecisive and ineffectual. When the French Revolution erupted, such personal ridicule merged seamlessly with political outrage, helping to strip away the mystique of the crown.